Harris administration, it's more likely to be a bull steepening. Either way, you're not doing as well out the long end. On a Trump victory, I think initially, if there's some safe haven flows, that would benefit the dollar, but only on a short-term basis.
So here's the latest. The dollar weaker as investors reprice bets on a second Trump presidency. Kit Jukes of SocGen writing, a Trump clean sweep and a Harris win without a clean sweep remains the two most likely outcomes in our view. And equally likely, these are the most bullish and most bearish outcomes for the dollar, respectively. Kit joins us now for more. So, Kit, I've known you long enough to say unhelpful. What are you telling people to do?
I was thinking about it. It's a bit like the sort of the Brexit story in terms of whether we're going to have a hard Brexit or not back in 2020, when you really have to be careful about where to go. I think we have to be sort of conscious of the fact that at the moment, what we're doing is seeing bets get taken off. The market got excited about the possibility of a Trump victory, and the Treasury market sold off. The dollar rallied. We're giving up back some of that. I think in terms of the places where the market has skew in its pricing, I think if Trump doesn't win, or if by some chance he didn't get a clean sweep, because that's very important as well, then currencies like the Australian dollar, where they decided not to cut rates this morning, and where they don't look like cutting rates this year, that looks like an undervalued currency on any scenario other than kind of the most aggressive Trumpian one in terms of fiscal expansion in the United States, tariffs on China, and maybe even only a modest Chinese policy response to that. So the Australian dollar might be the outlier. But if you said that that the yen is going to follow where bond yields are going to go almost regardless, then frankly, Trump wins with a clean sweep, dollar yen might be at 160, and Trump doesn't. Harris wins without a clean sweep, dollar yen might be breaking towards 140. So it's just a massive gamble that's very hard for people to cope with, and they have to hold tight until we see if we're going to get a result tomorrow morning.
But Kit, long term, if it is a Trump win, or potentially this clean sweep scenario with Congress going red as well, Trump has talked about the fact that he wants a weaker dollar. How do you be able to measure both of these basically conflicting results?
No, the dollar's strong because the United States has had exceptional fiscal policy, because the U.S. has issued a lot of bonds and bond yields have been higher, and the strength of the fiscal stance in the U.S. compared to everything we've done in Europe is that it has helped the economy outgrow the rest of the world spectacularly. Trump wants more growth. He wants to put tariffs in place to get more people into manufacturing jobs in the United States. At a starting point of pretty low unemployment already. He can't have that much cake and eat it in terms of an economy that's going to be even stronger, with fiscal policy continuing to be accommodative, and have a weak currency, because in the end, the biggest threat to Trump is going to be inflation on what we've heard so far. So he'd have to change some of his policies if he wanted a weaker dollar. We'll see how it plays out. But you get the currency your policies give you, not the currencies you wanted.
Kit, when you look at why the financial markets changed, was it because of the polling out of Iowa, or is it because they're basically a little bit nervous that they got too over their skis when it comes to the Trump trade?
Look, I think that if you looked at the dollar index and you plotted it against the betting odds from real clear politics and how they were going in favor of Trump, they moved very closely together. So the betting odds have moved back in line with the opinion polls in the last week, less than a week really, and Iowa played a part of that, and I think that's certainly seen people taking not just bets off perhaps in the betting space, but taking some of those trades off, and so we look today as if we're closer to a market that genuinely doesn't know what's going to happen. And maybe that's the right place for it to be.
Which raises this question, Kit, how violent could the reaction be in markets after we get some sort of result, given that everyone's going to be racing to it, no one really had an edge? Yesterday, Mike Wilson of Morgan Stanley was talking about how he sees a clearing event coming after we get the results from this, and that the clearing event could last a month. How violent of a clearing event could it be if we get a decisive result one way or another in the base cases that you laid out?
No, if you just tracked from the polls, so from Harris entering the polls and then Trump sort of coming back, and then where we are now, we're sort of 107, 101 in the dollar index. I imagine that a sudden sort of, when you're not sure, you get through those levels. That seems to me like the most likely outcome. So it's pretty violent. Again, if I look at dollar yen in terms of that, the violence of a dollar yen move depends on how much treasury yields can move. But we've had a big sell-off at the long end of the treasury market on concerns about more accommodative fiscal policy, increased bond supply, and some inflation worries. If you had a scenario where those melt away, the treasury market's pretty bearish at the moment in terms of sentiment. So a snapback rally there, what that could do to the yen is very striking. So right the way across the piece, we're not, I don't think we can avoid having a pretty violent reaction. And history says, we sometimes overshoot and then come back and settle down and decide that we'll have a look, because there'll be so many more questions. I mean, we have to sort of put in sort of minor adjustments in the sense of, whether someone has a clean sweep or not is very important. How it looks, and then we're going to work out whether either president can get what they want through Congress, irrespective of what that looks like. So there'll be lots more questions, but I think the initial reaction is likely to be pretty big, really, just because we're caught where we are.
Kit, are you watching the election from Mexico City?
I am not watching the election from Mexico City. No, that would be too exciting. But yes, you look at the impact on the yen, on the Australian dollar, on the Mexican peso, on all of Latin America, really. In fact, for once, Europe is likely to be less affected, I think, than the rest of the world. I mean, that doesn't mean it doesn't have an impact here, but the big story is Asia and Latin America.
Interesting. Kit, appreciate it, sir. Kit Jukes of SocGen. The global capitals will be watching Beijing and Mexico City.
Oh, big time. I mean, with Mexico City, there's a question of if Trump gets into office, unilaterally putting tariffs on. In Beijing, not only is there a real question around what policies will be, but they have their own question about how much stimulus to pump into the economy in their meeting that ends on Friday, where they're basically holding a watch party overnight to understand what the parameters are that they're going to be working with.
And potentially they may need to extend that meeting because we might not know the results. But Kit made a point there about the fact that even if you had a clean sweep, you might not get everything you want. And I think back to Biden the first 2 years, they had the Senate, they had the House, and they still were unable to close the carried interest loophole that they've all promised that they would do.
Things aren't straightforward in Washington, D.C. Up next on the program, Sarah Hunt of Alpine Saxon Woods, Terry Haynes of Pangea Policy, Kelsey Barrow of JP Morgan Asset Management, and we'll speak to Scott Besson of Key Square Group from New York. Good morning.
Countdown to the market open as we bring you the first trades across Europe.
We'll debate the most important stories and what will drive the big investment decisions throughout the morning. I'm Guy Johnson.
I'm Kriti Gupta.
And I'm Anna Edwards. Join us every weekday morning for the opening trade, live at 7 a.m. here in London.
Only on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
What's it like moving from the East Coast, where everything is finance and money, to the West Coast, where everything is technology? Did you fit in right away? And did you really know how to use all the computer things that they give you to use?
So it was pretty fun. There were plenty of times where I would sit around in meetings and literally I would be Googling terms. And at one meeting, Larry Page actually caught me Googling terms, and he kind of pointed that out to other people in the room, which was a little embarrassing, but I figured there were some things that I could do that they couldn't do. And so it was a learning curve. And my dad always, he taught me at a young age a term that I've used constantly with my teams. He said, in his lab at Stanford, if a physicist could not define a quark in under 30 seconds, they didn't know what they were talking about. And so I use the quark test all the time. If somebody's rambling on and they can't get to the point, they probably don't know what they're talking about, they fail the quark test. My finance team knows this quark test. And at Google, I'm working with amazing computer scientists, so they never fail the quark test. They can explain things really clearly, which shoots you up the learning curve.
But did you understand what they were talking about from the beginning, or did you have a special tutor that's taught you technology? Or did you
I had actually run tech banking and took Google Public, so I had a little sneak preview.
David Weston. Join me for the next generation of Wall Street Week, telling stories of capitalism from business, markets, economics, tech, and climate. Each week, we'll go on the road for a look at what lies behind the headlines of today and what will likely be the headlines tomorrow.
Above all else, it's a mission.
It's done nothing but grow immensely. To me, that's an extraordinary sign.
We can be the change that we want to see.
Watch the all-new Wall Street Week. More than what you need to know, it's what you need to think about.
Good morning. This is Bloomberg Surveillance.
Welcome back to the opening trade.
This is Bloomberg Technology.
This is the Asia Trade.
You're watching the close. Welcome to Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg. From our studios in New York and San Francisco, our expert hosts have the data and analysis about the companies you know and the startups to watch, plus the interviews you don't want to miss. Watch Caroline Hyde and Ed Ludlow on Bloomberg Technology, the only daily business show dedicated to tech, right in the middle of the trading action, every weekday, only on Bloomberg Television. Context changes everything.
The stakes are high this week for three reasons, and that's the Fed earnings and the election.
Trump presidency is probably more pro-growth. Harris would be probably a little less growth.
You're going to end up with some volatility regardless of what happens.
We are neck and neck right now, and we're not going to know until the votes are finally counted.
Even when you solve for Congress and you solve for the president, you've got to solve for a third issue, which is how much of what is being said will actually be implemented.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Jonathan Farrell, Lisa Abramowitz, and Anne-Marie Hordern.
It's like gearing up for a marathon, but you don't know how far you've got to run. Could be a day, could be two, could be a week.
Keep going.
It's election day in America. Equity futures on the S&P 500 up by 0.2% on the S&P. On the Nasdaq 100, futures elevated by 1/3%. In the bond market, yields bleeding just a little bit higher across the curve on a 2-year, 10-year, and 30-year. Yields are up 2 basis points on 10s, 430.70. Back in 2012, when Obama won, it was close to midnight. In 2016, when Donald Trump won, it was about 2:30 overnight. And then it took until Saturday of the same week to find out that Biden won 4 years later. How long is it going to take this time?
If the polls are correct, and that's a very big if, this could be the closest election, the closest race ever in history. The problem is everyone is saying it is implausible. It is statistically absolutely anomalous to see all of these polls that put these two candidates at a dead heat in all of the 7 swing states. So a lot of people are wondering, what are we all getting wrong?
The Harris camp is telling you to hunker down, basically. Jen O'Malley-Dillon yesterday saying they'll get near complete results from Georgia, North Carolina, and Michigan, as well as partial results from Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, Arizona. But she said that, quote, ballots will continue to be counted for many days. Maricopa County officials are telling you 10 to 13. There's no longer the days of waking up, going to your front stoop, and getting a newspaper with the President of the United States, President-elect, on the front page. This is going to take days, and everyone just needs to take a deep breath.
It could be weeks. Here's my deep breath. Equity futures on the S&P 500 up by 0.2%. Coming up, Sarah Hunt of Alpine Saxon Woods with markets on hold as Americans head to the polls. Terry Haynes of Pangea Policy calling for a 60% chance of a Harris victory. And we'll catch up with the Trump economic advisor, Scott Bessent, on why the former president would not weaken the US dollar. We begin this hour with stocks and the dollar holding steady as election day in America gets underway. Traders taking a cautious approach with the outcome uncertain and possibly days away. Sarah Hunt of Alpine Saxon Woods saying we can see a path to a reasonably good end to the year if there are no protracted political fights. But we also think caution going into 2025 is warranted. Sarah joins us now for more. Sarah, good morning.
Good morning.
Do you believe there will be some protracted political fights?
I hope not. But it's a difficult thing, because if it is as close as the polls are showing, then it probably will be. If it isn't, and you start to see a surprise one way or the other, like the Iowa surprise or another surprise where it starts to be clearer that it's not as tight, then I think you won't get as much of a protracted fight. But we'll just have to see. I don't think we have an answer yet.
Is caution warranted in 2025 regardless of the outcome in the next 24 hours?
I think so. I mean, I know that there's a lot of optimism on it's a reasonably good economy, it's a reasonably good earnings, everybody's doing okay. But we have this fiscal, elephant in the room, literally, that our deficits are widening no matter what we do and no matter who's talking about it. No one's talking about doing anything about that. Does that mean that we end up with higher bond yields than we would have normally? Does that mean that we get some sort of a change there? I think that is something that, as the cost of the debt gets higher and higher and becomes a bigger part of the budget, has to be addressed ultimately. And right now, no one's really talking about it.
Even in the bond market, they basically say it does have to get addressed. Maybe that's a 2027 story, and that's the reason why there haven't been this true upheaval in bond vigilantes coming to the fore. I do wonder, though, how much this just creates a problem for the bond market, not necessarily for the stock market. Because that's basically been the theory, that right now, yeah, bonds aren't a hedge to stocks as long as the economy is doing well, so why even hedge? And just go into equities, which are levered to a stronger growth, stronger inflation economy.
Well, the problem becomes if that stronger economy starts to get hindered by the fact that you now have a spending problem, right? So it's really about how does that translate through? And at the moment, that's not yet clear, but I do think it's a concern. And I think that you've seen the equity markets wobble every time the bond markets started to get wobbly. So I think that there is a correlation there, even though those correlations have not held up historically the way that they used to post the great financial crisis when we had zero interest rates for so long. I just think that when people start getting nervous about one thing, it translates into other things, and whether or not that nervousness is necessary and or is true, it almost doesn't matter.
So this is counter consensus. We were talking to Julian Emmanuel, and he was representing the view that typically markets continue on the path that they've been on, which has been up. If you believe this, how much are you de-risking ahead of this election, given that you see things very differently?
I think it's really more about just making sure that what you have is something that you think is a really good place to be. Where you are is a good place to be for the next couple of years. And that tends to be more thematic, and it also tends to be better balance sheets, higher quality, a lot of those things that don't always work as well when there's a lot of enthusiasm in markets, because some of the less quality stuff tends to move higher when people get very excited. But I think, to the extent that what you really want to see is a company that's able to sustain itself in any economic environment, that's more the direction that we're looking in than it is to be worried so much that there's going to be a major change. It's just more on the edges. I think there's likely to be more volatility, and I think that where multiples are right now, it's hard to say why they should just continue to go higher to the sky, right? Trees don't grow to the sky.
Sarah, when it comes to the rising debt load, this morning the Financial Times, Mohammed El-Arian quotes JFK, and basically, in times of sunshine, it's time to fix the roof, not be digging new holes. Which campaign potentially is going to dig bigger holes?
I think they've both promised to keep digging, right? You're in a hole, stop digging. But I haven't heard much rhetoric on either side that says this is something that really needs to be addressed. And the fact that we are in a growth economy and we are seeing these deficits and they're growing is not a good sign. Because if you do get into a real economic slowdown, that push to have fiscal policy come in and help becomes much more difficult when you've already got deficits that are quite high. No one has worried about them for a while, and there's been a lot of discussion about, well, why worry? If it hasn't been a problem yet, why is it going to be a problem? It's fine until it isn't, and I don't know where that line is, but at some point I think it does become a problem.
Well, finding that line potentially next year, you have all of these fiscal questions. You have the Trump-era tax cuts ending. There's this idea of there's going to be another protracted, potentially debt ceiling fight. Could 2025 be the time when the bond market pushes back and the deficit people, Lisa, are correct?
Well, it's going to happen at some point, but all the things that we thought were going to happen in some sort of timely manner got pushed to the right. I would have thought that inflation was coming when we started this whole experiment in 2008, 2009 of having zero interest rates forever and just throwing money at every problem. But it took years for inflation to catch up, and that was really partially because there was a pandemic that messed up the supply chain. So what we think of as these relationships from a historical standpoint have not held over the past 15 years. So it's difficult to parse how they're going to hold going forward. But you think about the fact that that port strike really got pushed out into the future too. There's a number of things that could come up in 2025. And it's more that, you have a great year in 2024. whatever is happening on the political front, everyone has a little bit of enthusiasm for that. And then you go into 2025 and people start looking at their outlooks and going, there's some things here that we could be concerned about. So it's really more about that. I'm not looking for some giant problem. I'm just saying that we've had a great couple of years in the market, and now we're looking at high multiples and some real uncertainty.
We've said it a million times on this program, truly flying blind into 2025. It's a pretty unique moment to have $4 trillion of tax cuts expiring next year, which is why the outcome of the Senate later on this evening is that much more important.
Especially given the fact that a lot of people just expect those to continue, and if they aren't, how much does that actually matter for the equity market more than for the bond market, since spending is going to expand either way? But you are correct. There are all of these intricacies that I expect to be the real distinguishing features between the different incremental moves that we see later tonight, which you'll be tracking all night long.
Thanks for that.
When it comes to the tax cuts, though, do you see any of these candidates wanting to raise taxes on those individuals making, say, less than $400,000, $500,000? No. Then it's the corporate tax rate. The gap is so wide. We're talking about 28% on one side, as low as 15% on another side, with conditions that no one has ever actually been transparent about.
Scott Besson coming up a little bit later. We'll try and get some clarity on that point. Sarah, it's good to see you.
Thank you.
Good to catch up. Sarah Hunt of Alpine, Saxon Woods. Equity futures right now on the S&P up by 0.2% with an update on stories elsewhere this morning. Here's your Bloomberg Brief with Danny Berger. Hey, Danny.
Hey, John. Despite rising debt, Aramco is keeping a $31 billion dividend. The company, which is majority owned by the Saudi state, is already paying out more than it's earning. Saudi's ambitious economic transformation plans, have widened the government's budget deficit, pushing Aramco into a net debt position for the first time in 2 years. The outlook for oil has also darkened with concerns over demand, but that dividend, it is seen as key for the government's finances. Shares of Nintendo, those are dropping lower by nearly 4% in the Japanese trade. The gaming giant slashed its full-year outlook, reported a 5th straight quarter of declining profits. Demand still lags for the aging Switch consoles, but rather than upgrading it, Nintendo has shifted focus to other products and ventures, including a museum, smartphone apps, and Hollywood films. The Kansas City Chiefs' perfect season continues after beating the Bucs in overtime last night. The Chiefs shook off a tense moment in the fourth quarter when QB Pat Mahomes had to be helped to his feet after injuring his left ankle. He was able to stay in the game, though, and throw another touchdown pass to put the Chiefs ahead. Mahomes orchestrated a 10-play drive in overtime, capped off by touchdown run from Kareem Hunt to seal the win for Kansas City. They're looking to secure the first three-peat in Super Bowl history. And that's your Bloomberg Brief. John.
Danny, thank you. More from Danny in about 30 minutes. Up next on the program, closing arguments.
Look, the ball's in our hand. All we have to do is get out the vote tomorrow. You get out the vote, they can't do anything about it. We win.
If you give me a chance to fight on your behalf as president, there is nothing in the world that will stand in my way.
That conversation up next. This is Bloomberg.
Politics to the world of business. Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines deliver news, insight, and analysis live every trading day. Balance of Power live around the world every weekday, only on Bloomberg. The countdown is on. Everything you need to get the edge at the end of the market day.
Big tech earnings kick off later this afternoon.
Gilead is coming out right now.
We have Take Two numbers. Back to the markets, right? Our bread and butter.
NVIDIA is one of the best stories in the tech space.
That actually matters a whole lot more.
It might shock some of your viewers.
You're watching The Close.
Get ahead of tomorrow's trading with The Close, weekdays on Bloomberg. Context changes everything. Bloomberg covers the world with unmatched reach and resources. From more than 120 countries, the moment news breaks, 24 hours a day. Bloomberg, context changes everything.
Equity futures on the S&P 500 up by 0.2%. In the bond market, yields aggressively lower to kick off a trading week. They bounced this morning up by 3 to 431. Under surveillance this morning, closing arguments.
Look, the ball's in our hand. All we have to do is get out the vote tomorrow. You get out the vote, they can't do anything about it. We win. We're the party of common sense.
If you give me a chance to fight on your behalf as president, there is nothing in the world that will stand in my way. I will spend every day on your behalf working on my to-do list.
So here's the latest. Harris and Trump delivering their final campaign rallies in the battleground states of Pennsylvania and Michigan. Almost $4 out of every 5 spent for the presidential election has gone to key swing states, with an astonishing $1.2 billion being spent on Pennsylvania alone, marking the first time a single state has seen more than $1 billion in ads. Joining us now is Bloomberg's David Gura from Philadelphia, Romaine Bostick from Detroit. David, first to you. You've been there a couple of days. How overwhelming has it been to be on the other end of these ad campaigns that we've seen build up over the last few months?
Look, I spent several hours yesterday walking around and talking to people here, and to a T, each one said they've been inundated with advertisements and outreach, and the fatigue is real. Yes, they understand the gravity and importance of this election, but they recognize they've been targeted by a lot of money and ads and outreach, and they are ready for this election to be over with. I spent last night on the promenade behind me here, Ben Franklin Parkway, in Philadelphia, which leads to the Philadelphia Art Museum. That's where Kamala Harris had her final rally, made her closing argument. It was a version of the stump speech that she's given now for many weeks, one that is heavy on optimism, didn't mention her opponent by name, and is sort of imploring those who are in the audience here to do a couple of things. 1, show up and vote themselves. 2, to have conversations with friends and loved ones about their plans to get to the polls and vote here today. They've been open for about 15 minutes. They'll be open here until 8 o'clock tonight. I said everyone's aware of how much money has been spent targeting them. They're also aware just of how critical this state is for both of these political parties, these 19 electoral college votes. Another speaker last night was Senator Bob Casey, the incumbent Democrat. He was on stage here. He is fighting for his seat, fighting for a 4th term in the U.S. Senate. He asking for the Democrats gathered there last night for their vote as well, as David McCormick campaigned in this state, who's running against him, of course, the Republican who spent some time as the chief executive at Bridgewater. A couple of contrasts I just want to note in that speech that we heard last night. Yes, the lightness, the optimism from Kamala Harris versus the darkness, the dark rhetoric that we heard from Donald Trump as he campaigned here in Pennsylvania, in North Carolina, in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where he closed things off last night at 2 o'clock in the morning. That's when he finished up his last speech and made his way down to Florida. Also just sort of the generational divide that we saw on display as well. Really an emphasis here in Philadelphia as we listen to Kamala Harris about how this is a big tent and she wants all people to be a part of it. Again, reiterating a message that we've heard from her on this campaign trail. And the last thing I'll say here to all of you is a lot of reflection on how much this campaign has done in a very short period of time. Of course, it's been just about 3 months since the incumbent president decided he's not going to seek re-election. Kamala Harris, numerous surrogates last night just acknowledging the fact that this is an unprecedented move that we've seen during this election cycle, and the amount of momentum, the amount of sort of work they had to do to introduce this vice president to a wider electorate was a monumental task, and they're feeling pretty good about it. Cautiously optimistic is what I've heard from a lot of party officials as I've called them throughout the state. Again, those polls are open. People are returning their mail-in ballots if they didn't get them in the USPS or to those voting stations in time going up to Election Day. But again, the emphasis here is the finish line is in sight, but they've got to run through it. That's what we're hearing from both of these candidates here in Pennsylvania today.
It certainly has been an unprecedented election cycle. Romaine, there's been a lot of criticism about the incumbent administration when it comes to their handling of the war in Gaza. Rank and file voters upset about electric vehicles being made in places like Detroit. You're on the ground there. What are you hearing as the most salient issue going to this election from individuals in Michigan?
Two words, foreign policy, believe it or not the economy, not reproductive rights, not immigration. When you go around the communities where I'm at here in Northwest Detroit, it is all about tariffs. It is all about manufacturing jobs lost. If you go just a little bit west to me, to the Muslim and Arab American enclaves of Dearborn Heights, Hamtramck, these are all communities that have voted by a wide margin for the Democratic Party for the last 30 to 40 years. That is not likely to happen in 2024. A major split, a major rift with regards to the Biden and Harris administration's handling of the war in Gaza. A protest vote, if you will. It's not going to Donald Trump. If you get this here, Kamala Harris amongst the Muslim and Arab American population, polling at less than 20%. Donald Trump, though, only polling at about 30%. The lion's share of those votes are apparently going to go to third-party candidate Jill Stein, a sign of protest amongst a lot of people here who want to send a message to both candidates. Right now, the polling center behind me here in Northwest Detroit, a working-class neighborhood, just opened just about 15 minutes ago. I did have a chance to catch up with election officials late last night who are expecting a pretty orderly process here. After all, compared to what we saw back in 2020 with the pandemic-induced constraints of that election, all the absentee ballots that came in late in that day, they're not expecting that this time around. As of last night, more than 47% of the folks here in the state of Michigan had already cast their ballots either through absentee ballots or early voting.
Romaine, just quickly, I'm curious about whether the view is that Jill Stein could take away a sizable portion of votes that otherwise would go to Kamala Harris. Is that what you're hearing from campaign officials?
I'm actually hearing the opposite, that a lot of those votes probably would have gone to Trump. Keep in mind, when I say foreign policy is a big issue here, Lisa, it's not only what's going on with regards to the situation in Gaza. Michigan is home to about 600,000 Polish Americans, one of the biggest concentrations of Polish Americans in the country, and they are also voting on a big single issue, and that is the war in Ukraine and what they see as Vladimir Putin's broadening power. I did speak with the head of the Polish American Association here, and she said that the voters there are probably just as split as a lot of Arab American voters there. Also a huge Jewish population here, also voting on the issue of Israel as well. Those three communities here could actually be the big determinant of whether Harris or Trump wins the presidency here in the state of Michigan.
World-class reporting from the Bloomberg team. Romaine Bostick, David Gura. Gentlemen, thank you. Terry Haynes of Pangea Policy joins us now for more. Terry, let's get to your calls. You've said Harris has the edge. You said 70% likely we get a split government. Democrats take the House, Republicans take the Senate. Small majorities. You've been quite consistent about this over the last few months. What underpins that view, Terry?
The consistency comes from the simple fact that the polls have been awfully static, John. I mean, it's not a lot more than that. My Harris call is based, frankly, just on, you've got, in a tied race, you have to look at the intangibles. And Harris's organization, voter enthusiasm, and message discipline that, combines social issue focus with Trump loathing, I think barely beats a Trump campaign that has demonstrated hard voter ceiling, focuses on a tiny sliver of swing state voters. There's a split Republican Party with at least 20% who don't want Trump and are susceptible to moving over. And there's a lack of appeal in the Trump campaign to centrist undecideds. I think that all those things combine to give a small nod to Harris.
So, Terry, what did you make of the Iowa poll? Is this basically what you've been trying to explain the last few months, that she is correct, that the polling right now is underestimating some of potentially shy Harris voters?
I think Ann Selzer is a unicorn that always needs to be taken seriously. Ann's the first person to say, and did say, she thought it was a shock poll, and seems to be an outlier. That doesn't make it any less true. The undercard on that poll, by the way, is interesting, which is there are four seats, House seats in Iowa, all Republican. Selzer's poll has two of them being lost to Democrats, and the third the Democrat is within 3 points. So you got that, but what Ann shows in that poll is the same thing that's been shown all year. You've got women that are hugely concerned about social issues, number one, and number two, you've got that hard Trump ceiling and Trump loathing going on. Ann had back in January that there were 40% of Republican primary voters who said that they weren't going to vote for Trump in the general, and that was the first piece of evidence to me that led to the Republican Party split that I think has been pretty clearly demonstrated.
So tonight when the polls close, when it comes to Pennsylvania, I was looking at Bucks and Erie County, but you're looking at Washington County. That's your bellwether. Why?
Very simply, Washington County has it all. Washington County has, in the Pittsburgh region, Washington County has the house prices, the highest house prices in the entire Pittsburgh region, in an area that hugs Allegheny County. Called Peters Township, but you literally cross a creek from Peters Township into Nottingham Township, a town called Finleyville, and the house prices drop by half or more, as does the income, and it gets poorer and poorer and poorer the farther south that you move. So if you want to see whether the independent women, they're pretty well off, come out in droves for Harris, that's a place to look. If you want to see if Trump can goose a lot of people who normally don't vote and bring them out to the polls to cancel out those people in the northern half of the county, you'll see it there. You will see the entire race in Pennsylvania play out in Washington County based on which is stronger.
How will the early voting and the fact that about half of the people who voted in the previous election have voted so far heading into this election day that really is election season, how does that change the nature of how we get results trickling out?
Well, it depends on the state. In Pennsylvania, they don't start counting, I understand, until the early vote until Election Day itself. So that's a large factor in frankly, the stringing out of the election results that you all were talking about before. But, largely it depends on the state. But beware anybody trying to read anything into this. Just because there's a party registration shift that exists in Pennsylvania towards Republicans as much as anything else, that doesn't mean those people are all voting for one candidate or the other. And, as Romaine just pointed out, too, you got a situation where just because there's registration advantages in one place or another, there's protest votes, special issues, all kinds of things.
Hey, Terry, we'll see you later this evening, sir. Terry Haynes of Pangea Policy. Looking forward to it, Terry. Thank you. Big takeaway from the conversation we just had. Romaine Bostic, Detroit, Michigan.
Yeah.
Not about the economy. It's about foreign policy.
And each individual group and how that is changing their decision to vote, who to vote for, whether to show up, and just how these people have been really catered to in that, what was it, $700 million of advertising that's been put in there by
Because why? In 2016, Hillary Clinton lost Michigan by 10,704 votes. If all of those voters that voted for Jill Stein decided to go for Hillary Clinton, she would have won the state.
Super small margins. That's what we're talking about. Super, super razor-thin margins potentially going into this one. Coming up on the program, Kelsey Barrow of JP Morgan Asset Management as investors brace for election volatility. Equity futures right now up 0.1%. Bond yields bleeding just a little bit higher. From New York, this is Bloomberg.
of decentralized finance.
We thought we'd take a look at Bitcoin versus the S&P 500.
Bloomberg's covering all things crypto, the people,
the tectonic shift emanating from Washington.
It's really a tale of two cities in crypto.
Crypto shouldn't be partisan.
the transactions,
Really a record-breaking moment.
Crypto VC is back.
and the technology.
It's really the beginning of a global on-chain economy.
And if America doesn't embrace it, we're going to be left behind.
Bloomberg Crypto, only on Bloomberg.
Always on the heartbeat of the tech
spread across global markets.
The real-time data aspect is going to be important.
We're going to bring you expert analysis on that. Sure.
Don't miss Bloomberg's interview with the
Bloomberg loves earnings.
I know it's like your Super Bowl, right?
I can't wait. It's like opening presents in the morning.
All right, it will be exciting.
Nobody covers earnings like Bloomberg.
Good morning. This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Tom McKenzie in London. These are the stories that set your agenda.
Taking you from the U.S. market's close to the overnight session in Asia. We'll walk you through what you need to know to kickstart the European trading day. Live from our European headquarters, we bring you the day's top market-moving stories, unmatched expert analysis, and on-the-ground reporting from across the continent. Tune in every weekday at 6 a.m. London time, only on Bloomberg Television.
Here's a snapshot of things this morning. Good morning to you and welcome to the program. Equity futures on the S&P up by 0.1%. On the Nasdaq 100 up by 0.2%. 2 hours away from the opening bell with your morning movers. Here's Manus Cranny. Hey Manus.
Jonathan, a very good morning to you. There's an audible sigh of relief from Kelly Ortberg as 59% of the workers have agreed to a pay deal. So this closes off a 53-day strike. Now this company is making 4 planes a month. That is 1 a week at the moment. So this is all about getting started up again. Can they get back to the low 20s on the 737 MAX? You have Michael O'Leary in the studio yesterday talking about the very holdback from Boeing is what's restraining his growth numbers. 38 is the magic number. That's on the 737. That's the maximum that they can produce. But this company's still going to lose money this year and the first half of next year. But it's relief at the moment. By the way, those workers go from 76,000 to 119,000, and the deal is going to cost Boeing about $1 to $2 billion. Palantir bid up this morning. Wow. I mean, Peter Thiel must be happy this morning. This is, in their words, unwavering demand for AI. Just think of the kind of companies. This is a huge government contract supplier delivering AI. Defense spending is the highest in 4 years with this company. Government contracts growth up 40% in the third quarter. And of course, they were included in the S&P in September time. So happy days for Palantir on the AI overlay on everything to do with government, defense, and any other company. Let's round it off with Wynn Resort. Yes, I love the line that you used this morning, which was, you know, Marriott might have a problem with the election in terms of people booking rooms, but when it comes to big betting in Las Vegas and Macau, I think this is a manifestation of China, the amount of stimulus, the amount of underperformance in Macau relative to the rest of the market. Earnings disappointed on sales. Earnings per share 90 cents, down from 99 cents a year ago and below the estimate. So you've got a little bit of pressure. It's a different, I think, political story relative to Marriott. Jonathan.
Yeah, you're right, Manus, and thank you for that. It's been a proxy to play stimulus hopes through. Wynn Resorts and other stocks like that.
So there is this bigger question. Is this actually just an excuse, or are there actually some people who are delaying their travels? Might be a little bit of both. I will just say from a business travel perspective, because it's not a big holiday time, if you travel, what do you tell your clients right now? Are you going to do fundraising? Because what project are you going to be having absolute conviction about? And if you're going to tell your clients your incredible analysis about who's going to win, we don't know. I mean, it's essentially what's going on.
Manus mentioned it again, so let's go back to it. The CFO over at Marriott International, a key measure of hotel demand, declining in November by double that of past election cycles. Is it just the election, or is it something else?
We'll find out in weeks and months to come. That said, I was just looking at some other quotes from big executives around corporate America. This is one from the CEO of Snap-on. Welcome to the Mad Hatter's Tea Party. Nobody knows what's actually going to happen, so you can't even make a pronouncement. This from Etsy. The nonstop political noise is, quote, an incredibly distracting mind share event. And even homebuilder D.R. Horton talking about how do you have conviction given some sort of big purchase if you don't know the path of the interest rates, nor nevertheless the backdrop for taxes and other big policy aspects.
A roll of dice if you want to lock in an interest rate right now. Under surveillance this morning, the US presidential race on a knife's edge as Americans head to the polls today. Voters across 7 swing states likely to decide the election outcome. Harris and Trump delivering their closing arguments in dueling rallies last night in Pennsylvania and Michigan.
It's going to be a long night. It's going to be a long few days. I keep coming back to the fact that these election officials in Arizona are saying it could be 10 to 13 days. Jonathan, you're going through what happened in 2016. We knew relatively quickly, at least overnight by the morning, you knew what direction of travel policy was going to be going in Washington, D.C. 2020, it wasn't like that because of all these mail-in ballots. This year, more than 80 million people have already voted. So this election day is off to a pretty good start. If you talk to either campaign, all they'll keep telling you is it's all about turnout, but turnout where? Is it rural Americans or is it people in the big cities?
We've seen a ton of scenario analysis, and we always say you can learn something from the information you receive and you can learn something else from how the market responds to that information. Sometimes you don't find out how the market's going to receive any particular makeup of government until the night, the day after, the week after, the month after. 2016 is a classic example of just that.
I was just going to say, the poster child being 2016, because guess what? Everyone expected the market to tank, and it did the opposite. This time around, unclear how we're positioned, but people do think more of a Trump victory is baked into markets.
Let's get you some news elsewhere. Apple is exploring a push into smart glasses. Sources telling Bloomberg the company kicked off an internal study of products currently on the market last week. The research set to guide the company and what features it includes in its own glasses as Meta makes a big effort here, right?
Yeah, but Meta's glasses are a little bit more expensive than the price point for this, which I believe is something like $299. It still is years away from it. I could just imagine my conversation with my kids later on when this becomes a thing. If I'm speaking to you, take off your glasses. I mean, honestly, how distracted are people going to be? Like, you know, are they looking at you or are they reading their texts? I just am trying to envision this world and exactly how people exist in it.
Those Meta Ray-Ban glasses, though, have now hit the Oprah Winfrey favorite things holiday gift guide. She says she's going to be giving them to people. She loves how you can wear them. Traveling, it can translate a menu from a foreign language into English, take pictures as you're walking through a new city. So I feel like Apple's now catching up to potentially what Meta's been seeing. I remember Ed Ludlow was talking about this is going to be one of the most transformational pieces of tech.
He was moved by it.
He was moved by those
Genuinely,
Ray-Ban glasses. And so was Oprah.
Apparently. Let's get to this final story. New York Times tech workers going on strike. 600 software developers and others who run the back-end systems behind the company's digital operations walking out just before Election Day. The two sides negotiated until Sunday and failed to come to an agreement. Talk about timing.
Yeah, and that's actually the comment from some of the executives over at the New York Times. Really, guys, it's disappointing that you choose this time. Of course, the tech workers say for their behalf, we've worked incredibly hard to try to lay the groundwork so that there will not be any disruptions. The key issue here is this comes at one of the highest volume times when everyone's pressing refresh, refresh, refresh. Do you have any potential victories to announce?
All night, and maybe for days, and possibly even weeks. Let's turn back to markets. Traders counting down to the US election and bracing for big swings on razor-thin margins. Kelsey Barrow of JP Morgan writing, price action has been choppy in recent days as investors look to manage positions before the elections. After elections, however, markets tend to refocus on the prevailing fundamentals. This is likely to be true again this year, with the exception being in a sweep outcome. Kelsey joins us for more. Kelsey, good morning.
Good morning.
Can we talk about that exception? Why would the sweep change things so much for you?
Well, essentially, there's a number of different things that we can focus on. There's the 4 key outcomes. You have divided Congress or divided government with Harris or Trump, and then you have the sweep outcomes. The sweep outcomes are where the market is going to be focused on a real shift in the fiscal trajectory that causes the Fed, that causes the markets to have to consider that the current path for the economy may be altered. So that's really the scenarios where I think that there is still a lot of uncertainty around how that path is going to be altered. In a divided government, I do think that we're going back to more of a status quo where we can refocus on the fundamentals, which is the way that we've been positioned all along. That's growth that's healthy, jobs that are slowing, wages that are moderating, inflation under control. Essentially, the expansion continues.
So take us inside your emergency playbook that you have out on your keyboard this evening as you watch the election results come in. Are you basically saying if you get divided government and signs of that, buy bonds? If you don't get divided government, you get some sort of sweep, then it's less clear, maybe sell, maybe don't have conviction. What sort of are the trades that you're looking for?
It's probably too simplistic to put it like that. So you have 4 outcomes that are the key outcomes, but talking to our colleagues, for instance, in Market Insights, David Kelly, their playbook has 10 different potential scenarios. So within those 4 scenarios, there's all of this gray area that we need to manage. And I think the key is, with all this uncertainty, is really not to get distracted and use this as an excuse to stay in cash. So our motto has been follow the alphabet, the ABCs, anything but cash. So don't use this kind of noise as an excuse to distract you from the opportunities that are out there within the financial markets, and particularly within fixed income. We've had a remarkable trend of strong growth. Real final sales has been rock solid around 3%. Companies are doing well, and you can still build portfolios of bonds that yield 6 to 8% right now, that we think are very well positioned for a variety of outcomes.
So you say anything but cash, but tonight cash is actually incredibly helpful, because what a lot of people are looking for is potential dislocations in the market that they can take advantage of. How much are you looking to take advantage of specific dislocations? What are they that you are looking to go in and buy?
That is a good point. So we don't have any specific edge. I don't think anyone has any specific edge over these outcomes. But what we do have is setting ourselves up for flexibility to take advantage of anything that does become dislocated, particularly in the rate space, in the FX space. We've been looking at swap spreads, which have become very, very negative. That's a potential trade that has been focused on by hedge funds that are looking at the deficit moves. These are all things that we're looking at. And when I kind of take it back to, where should the 10-year yield be in a status quo scenario, one where we refocus on the fundamentals following the elections, based on the growth backdrop, based on the inflation backdrop, one that inflation is pretty close to 2, growth is healthy, but it's slowing. The Fed is cutting. They can continue to cut next year. I would say that's a 10-year yield around 3.5 to 4. Why are we not there now? I think it's pretty clear there's a decent amount of term premium in the market.
Take out the data, though. Where's the 10-year yield if Trump wins?
I think you could see a knee-jerk reaction that brings the 10-year yield significantly higher, 4.5, 4.75. But it also really depends on not just what happens with the presidency, but all of those gray areas. So not just the 4 scenarios, but the 10 different scenarios. And we also don't know what he's going to focus on in his first few days in office. He has talked about many different policy initiatives, but which ones will he prioritize first? Are they going to be the things that are growth positive, or are they going to be the things that are more focused on, foreign policy and inflation, which the tariffs raise prices, but they're also dampening on growth. So we need to understand what order of priorities either candidate is ultimately going to take if they win.
But the knee-jerk reaction for Trump could be higher yields. What's the knee-jerk reaction for Harris? Is it as low as where you think the 10-year should be trading at 3.5%?
So I think that you do see some trades that have already been put into the market that suggest that, if we were to see a Harris win, then you could see yields move a bit lower. But again, it really depends, refocusing back on the fundamentals. So to us, one of the most important things that we were watching last week was the jobs report, because I think there was a lot of uncertainty about if the labor market was actually reaccelerating here. And we were under the belief that no, the labor market actually is still cooling. That number in September is an outlier, and we're going to see it in the revisions. So what I've been doing is, when I look at the labor market data, I just look at everything through September. If you include October, I mean, you're creating an opportunity where you're likely to get whipsawed. But if you look through September, I think it's pretty clear. The labor market is still slowing, inflation is still cooling, wages are still moderating. That's generally an environment that's fairly good for fixed income.
This might be a short news conference on Thursday, don't you think? sort of open it up, read the decision, close the book, thank you, head for the exits.
We cut by 25 basis points. Nobody cares. Go
Questions?
back to watching
No
the
questions.
elections. Cool.
Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Or every political question, there's going to be no comment.
No comment, no comment. Kelsey, it's good to see you. Good to catch up as always. Kelsey Barrow there of JP Morgan Asset Management. Let's get you an update on stories elsewhere this morning with your Bloomberg brief. Here's Danny Berger. Hey, Danny.
Hey, John. Yum Brands saw its sales fall more than expected in the third quarter. Growth at Taco Bell failed to offset ongoing weakness at Pizza Hut and KFC. The fast food operator's overall comparable sales, those declined 2%. KFC, for its part, posted a third straight quarterly decline. Taco Bell saw comparable sales rise 4%. Restaurant Brands, the owner of fast food chains Burger King and Popeyes, also missed sales expectations. Wells Fargo is set to begin the first ever contract negotiations between a big U.S. bank and unionized employees. The bargaining will happen today at a branch in Albuquerque, New Mexico. The location unionized last December, making it the first branch of a big U.S. bank to do so. So far, 22 Wells Fargo branches have joined the vote to unionize. The Cleveland Cavaliers are the last undefeated team in the Eastern Conference after they beat the conference worst Milwaukee Bucks last night. Darius Garland had 39 points with 7 three-pointers along with 8 assists for the Cavs. They currently hold a one-game lead over the defending champs, the Boston Celtics. And in the Western Conference, the OKC Thunder improved to 7-0 after a dominant win over the Orlando Magic. And that's your brief. John.
Danny, thank you. We'll see you in about 30 minutes. Up next on the program, the final word.
4 years of Kamala have delivered nothing but economic hell for the American workers and the auto workers, all workers. Her inflation disaster has made life unaffordable.
Up next on the program, The View from the Trump campaign. Then 30 minutes later, we'll catch up with Mark Cuban for The View from the Harris campaign.
Do you think it'll be the case where someday you will be an investment committee or I'll be an investment committee and we just apply AI, decide whether it's a good deal or not, or we're not going to be there anytime soon?
I don't think we'll be there in the near term. And David, because, being on investment committees, there's the analytics of the math, there's the people, and then there's judgment. So analytics of the math, I think AI will help us get way more refined. Right now, we have analysts building models upon models. Our typical investment memo is 86 pages. So we could refine that down very, very seamlessly to pieces. The people aspect to it, to make a judgment call on, do I believe this entrepreneur is going to go the next mile? Do I believe that the background of the entrepreneur, who they are, what they stand for, their values, their family, that's the harder one. I think AI is going to take some time to get there. And then the final piece ends up being judgment. And I don't believe we've seen anything yet that gives us a sense of judgment that we're able to apply.
Jumpstart your trading day on Bloomberg Open Interest.
2 hours of single stock stories that are driving the opening bell action. We'll take you to Wall Street, Main Street, the C-suite, and beyond.
These are companies that are growing their market.
The great companies in the U.S. are the companies hitting the cutting edge. That's a different story.
Get the inside track on what's buzzing in markets.
With the players who are shaping the narrative.
If you have bad earnings reports, you're going to get punished.
They're not buying what the industry is selling. Join us on Bloomberg Open Interest. Every trading day, only on Bloomberg.
Middle East and Africa. Vibrant resources and high-yield investment opportunities abound. Join me on Horizons Middle East and Africa for the stories, newsmakers, and insight from this exciting region. Now weekdays, only on Bloomberg.
Equity futures up 0.1%. Bond yields higher by 4 basis points. The 10-year 4.32. Under surveillance this morning, the final word.
4 years of Kamala have delivered nothing but economic hell for the American workers and the auto workers, all workers. Her inflation disaster has made life unaffordable and cost families over $30,000 in higher prices. We've got to get the prices down, and we will. We will launch the most extraordinary economic boom the world has ever seen.
So here's the latest. Trump closing his campaign with promises for a better economy. Scott Besson of Key Square Group, a top economic advisor to the former president, telling the Financial Times if Trump wins the election, he won't weaken the dollar. Besson also defending Trump's pledges on tariffs, saying at the end of the day, he's a free trader. He's escalate to de-escalate. Scott Besson joins us now for more. Scott, welcome to the program. And first of all, sir, thank you for being with us, because I know that rally wrapped up at 2 a.m. Eastern time. So you've only just landed, I believe, down in Florida. So Scott, share with us. Here's my question for you and for Mark Cuban this morning when we catch up with Mark a little bit later. If you're an undecided voter this morning, waking up and you're going to the polls and you still just can't get there, Harris or Trump, what's your message to them?
Well, it's quite easy because the choices are quite stark. And we have a very unusual situation here because we've had a real-time experiment. We had a Trump presidency that delivered low inflation, the high real wage growth, and the, good economic growth, especially for working Americans. Working Americans actually saw their household net worth increase more than the top percentiles. We also have an experiment with Vice President Harris and Joe Biden, where we had the highest inflation in 40 years. The bottom 50% of workers are getting crushed. I call it the 3 I's: inflation, interest rates, and immigration. And if you want more of that, then you should vote for it. But it's a very unusual situation where both candidates have run policy.
Scott, when Trump left the White House, though, unemployment was at 6.4%. Today, it's at 4.1%. This is very low unemployment.
And Marie, that's a bit of sophistry. That was COVID, and you know it. Why don't we stop the clock at January 2020 and go from there? And it was one of the strongest economies ever.
So let's talk about some of the president's policies then. You say he's not going to weaken the dollar, but he gave an interview with Bloomberg Business Week, and he said the strong dollar is actually a problem. Why do you think he actually won't try to weaken it?
Well, I think that he believes it's a market reaction, and I also think he understands that tariffs have the tariffs cause a stronger dollar. So a weaker dollar with tariffs is it's an economic abnormality. So I think we could see what's called the dollar smile, which you start out, right now we have high interest rates, high deficit, and if you were, and the still inflation above target. If you were to get inflation down to or below target through deregulation, through energy, then interest rates could come down, and you would have a market-based dollar depreciation. But in terms of an overt weak dollar policy, I wouldn't expect that at all. And the other thing too, if we go back to what's the pitch, and I'm very interested to hear Mark Cuban say this, because I think what I find very odd with the Harris supporters, especially the Wall Street and billionaire class like Mark Cuban, the wink and the nod is, well, she's got these crazy policies, but the Republicans are going to have the Senate, so you don't have to worry about these policies going through. So if half of the Harris supporters are saying the reason to vote for her is because there'll be a Republican Senate, that's quite odd, where 100% of the people who are voting for Donald Trump today want a Republican trifecta. They want him to be able to implement all his policies. So that's going to be a very interesting conversation. I look forward to watching it.
Scott, but the Trump campaign says Kamala Harris stole some of his key proposals. So did they steal them, or is her proposals, what you're saying, are actually a little bit too crazy?
Well, I can tell you that the tax on unrealized capital gains, I've been doing this for 35 years. I've done business in over 60 countries, and that is the worst idea that I've ever seen. It is a death spiral for markets, for capital. And when David Murphy decided in the presidential debate to two-on-one President Trump, and he said, oh no, Kamala Harris isn't a communist because a communist seizes the means of production. Taxing unrealized capital gains is seizing the means of production.
Scott, you raised a question.
She's walked back a lot of things, and this is not one of the things she's walked back.
Yeah, Scott, you raised a lot of points here, and I think that one really interesting point is that one of the arguments that people make about Kamala Harris's policies is a lot of them won't go into effect. You could say the same thing about Donald Trump's policies, that a lot of the crazy ideas with the tariffs or potentially that could be destructive to growth won't go into effect, and as soon as he sees the stock market tank, he's going to reverse course. Is that true?
Well, but again, Lisa, that would be Donald Trump's decision. It would not be because he didn't want to. With Kamala Harris, it would just be because she's unable to do it. Let's look what she did when the Democrats had the trifecta. She was the tie-breaking vote on the Orwellian named Inflation Reduction Act and the American Rescue Plan. $4 trillion of spending that set off the biggest inflation in 40 years. So if you want her to have the trifecta, have at it again.
Well, hold on a second. But Scott, a lot of people come around this table who are analysts and in the financial markets say that a red sweep with President Trump would cause inflation to go up, would cause bond yields to go up. That would be the most bearish situation for bonds. Are you disagreeing with that? I mean, essentially, that would be considered more inflationary, potentially, than anything that Kamala Harris could do.
Well, I think it's absurd to say that Donald Trump would be inflationary. If bond yields go up, they would be going up because there is a growth impetus, and the market would price in a higher growth trajectory. In my mind, it will not be because inflation will be going up.
Scott, it's good to hear from you. If you can stay awake for 30 minutes and watch the Mark Cuban interview, we look forward to your feedback. Thank you, sir. Looking forward to tonight. Scott Besson there of Key Square Group. Coming up in the next hour, we'll hear from Mark Cuban, a Harris donor, a minority owner of the Dallas Mavericks. That conversation in about 30 minutes.
Interesting to see what Mark Cuban has to say, especially since he has been out and about supporting her every single day. He's almost like the Elon Musk because he's a donor, because he's a billionaire, except he's a little bit less, jumping off on stages.
Where's his $1 million a day giveaway? Where's his?
Oh, is that what you're going to ask him? Are you going to open that up?
That's what I want to know.
Why aren't you giving people $1 million to sign up for the right to vote for arms?
Where your mouth is. All that stuff.
Oh, is that what that is? That's what that's called.
Is it a lottery or is it a job?
Still don't know. The judges decided it's one and not the other, so there you go. Coming up on the program, Cameron Dawson of New Edge Wealth, Neil Dutta of Renmac, Dallas Mavericks minority owner Mark Cuban, and our team covering the Trump and Harris campaigns. From New York, the third hour of Bloomberg Surveillance. Up next.
In terms of how we should deal with the challenges that are, facing the world and also internally, I think it's just an opportunity also, an angle. And you could see that in a lot of activities that are picking up in this region, simply because it's a region that is actually a bright spot amongst very few in the world today. And people always talk about the flavor of the month. Actually, I don't want to sound too, large-headed, but actually we will be the flavor of decades. We are determined, we have long-term plans, and we are very clear and committed on our commitment to the investment community at large. I'm not talking about one individual country, but at large in the GCC, that we mean business, that we are willing to take every step possible to make it easier for investors to do business in the region, that we are willing to do a lot of structural changes, including actually making it very predictable, very consistent policies.
It's the world's second largest economy with a growing influence in global affairs. But geopolitical uncertainties, deflationary pressures, and questions about foreign investment linger. Bloomberg, the China Show, brings you the unmatched expertise you need to keep track of breaking news, in-depth market analysis, and the most influential newsmakers in and around China. Bloomberg, the China Show. Weekdays around the world, right here on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
What about artificial intelligence? Is artificial intelligence going to enable you and others to say, we have enough information to know exactly what something is going to be worth in terms of insuring it or not?
Artificial intelligence is finding its way into our business in a variety of different factors. I think the first piece is getting much better insight into data, which allows us to make better decisions on underwriting. It's also a great opportunity to service business better in terms of like call centers and different ways of what's using robotics and other AI will be very helpful. But it is an emerging practice within the industry and one that is evolving very quickly. So it's also going to present risks that other companies, how they use it and how they use large language models and making sure the decision making is very sound. So it's complicated, but it definitely is benefiting the business today.
It's the countdown to the market open as we bring you the first trades across Europe.
We'll debate the most important stories and what will drive the big investment decisions throughout the morning. I'm Guy Johnson.
I'm Kriti Gupta.
And I'm Anna Edwards. Join us every weekday morning for the opening trade, live at 7 a.m. here in London.
Only on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
There is a very bearish setup of the investors going into the election day.
As the presidential race goes, probably the Senate races go. The polls are razor thin in the states that matter and the communities that matter.
There's a very big difference between what voters in the swing states feel are important issues.
There's a lot of conflicting signals, most of which are showing this to be a tie or toss-up race.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Jonathan Ferro, Lisa Abramowitz, and Anne-Marie Hordern.
90 minutes away from the opening bell, your scores look like this on the S&P 500 across the equity board. Elevated, just a touch on S&P 500 futures up by 0.2%. On the Nasdaq 100, up by a third. In the bond market, big start to the week for fixed income, big rally through this bond curve. The 2-year bounces back, yields up by 3 basis points to 4.19. On a 10-year up by 4 to 4.32.51. Mike Wilson of Morgan Stanley on this program yesterday said that this would be a market clearing event, that we could get up to 6K on the S&P 500. Is it that, or is it a defining event for the next 12, 24 months?
It depends on what the outcome is. It seems like the bar is high or low, depending on who you talk to, for something that could truly be formative. Ultimately, though, it doesn't come into who's at the top of the ticket, and I feel like I'm just basically parroting everything that you're about to say or have been saying, which is it really has to do with the composition of Congress, and as we heard from Kelsey Barrow, basically the gray details that we have to parse through throughout the night.
The composition of Congress is really important for things like tax cuts, to make sure that we don't blow through the debt ceiling, which is going to be a fight starting January 1, 2025. When it comes to tariffs, that is where actually the executive branch can act alone. Not on everything, because there is some legal precedent, potentially how big the wall potentially could go up. They would need Congress's backing. But that is the one area where if Trump wins, he can do that unilaterally on day one.
That's why you have to split up these trades. There are tariff trades, think dollar mex, and then there are basically bond market trades, tax cut trades, higher yields. Think about what this could mean for the Federal Reserve. There's a lot on the table. for the next 12 months.
Yeah, especially at a time where either candidate is going to expand the deficit. You look at the ranges, and some of the nonpartisan projections have the base case for Donald Trump raising the fiscal deficit over the next 4 years to by $7.7 trillion. Kamala Harris is only $3.7 trillion. Nonetheless, what you're talking about is a much deeper deficit at a time where there is no attention spent right now, paid attention to just in terms of how you offset this and create a more fiscal and plausible future.
I go back to what Mohamed El-Erian wrote in the Financial Times this morning. He's like, these election promises do not mean they're going to be policy. Look at the tax cuts that just this election cycle has introduced. Corporate tax rate, 15%, 28%, red or below. No tax on tips. Everyone seems to agree on that. Social Security exemption, extend the 2017, all of those tax cuts, $5,000 tax credit, consider eliminating federal tax incomes for first responders. Harris, expand the child tax credit, increase corporate tax rate, increase capital gains tax, proposals to provide $25,000 if you're buying a new home. Is any of this really going to happen?
I think we're all exhausted by all of this, aren't we? It's gone on for months and months and months. We've had assassination attempts, a last-minute candidate change. Over the last 2 months, we're all trying to get our hands around fresh policy coming from Harris, who's trying to redefine herself away from the person we knew back in 2019. And once you've got through all of that, can you imagine being in Pennsylvania and you face down $1.2 billion worth of ad spend from these two campaigns over the last few months? Those numbers are incredible.
Which means that people are really sick of hearing them, but they also feel a little bit more political urgency, as we heard from David Gura down there. What I thought was interesting is the corollary, the knock-on effects. 1-800-Flowers came out and said, media is more expensive. The election does have a big, big impact on what we pay for things, both digitally and in traditional media.
Can't advertise.
You can't advertise because how can you go up against that incredible wash of money?
Getting crowded out over the last few months. Do you think that's why Marriott is seeing spend on hotels coming down?
Because they're not able to advertise in Pennsylvania and Michigan.
Futures on the S&P up by 0.2%. Coming up this hour, Cameron Dawson of New Edge on the election boogeyman that could spook markets. Neil Dutta of Renmac following US economic data. And we'll catch up with the Dallas Mavericks minority owner, Mark Cuban, making the case for Kamala Harris. We begin this hour with stocks on hold on the last day of voting in America. Cameron Dawson of New Edge writes the following. Given how tight polls and odds are, we see the election as a source of near-term volatility, regardless of the result. Each side has boogeymen that could spook markets. Cameron joins us now to talk about those men. Cameron, who are those men?
Well, those men certainly are things like higher deficits, higher corporate taxes, tariffs, and immigration. And I think Anne-Marie's point was really important, is that if we think of the tariffs line of things, it doesn't necessarily matter about the makeup of Congress, that we could see them if Trump is elected, which is certainly some of the questions that you've seen raised by the bond market and considering potentially stickier inflation. So we think regardless of who wins tonight or whenever we get those results, it effectively is going to be a surprise because those polls are so very tight, which means that it could be a volatility-inducing event. I think it's important to note, though, that markets aren't necessarily primed for volatility to continue. You've seen a huge buying of put options for the VIX, effectively people betting on volatility collapsing post the election. So again, this could simply be a surprise, and it could cause that higher volatility, given the fact that people aren't necessarily positioned for it.
I want to pick up on that point because you see this across a range of different volatility metrics. Basically, people expect volatility, price swings to really peak tomorrow and then absolutely fade off as we get results and go back to some sort of status quo. From your vantage point, how much are you looking to actually take advantage of something that could be more significant? How offsides would this market be? And what would you do with that?
We always try to see volatility as opportunity, and I'd raise the question of if we would be seeing this volatility even if this wasn't election day. If you look at things like S&P 500 momentum and breadth, they've all been deteriorating over the last month. You've also seen a deterioration in forward earnings estimates. You've seen estimates for 4Q as well as 2025 get cut and trimmed. So I would raise the question of if we could have this volatility, even if this was not election day, simply because you have a lot of digestion of the strong gains that we've had year to date and kind of putting some of the seasonality aside, given that deterioration in breadth and momentum, that just sets you up for a little bit more churn.
At this point, Cameron, you have to understand, I have to understand, and I don't understand exactly how much we've already priced in some of these trades, what these trades actually are. I'm thinking in particular in the bond market. People have been wondering, you strip out the political influence, what does a 10-year yield look like? Do you have a sense of that?
Well, we do know that there has been a relationship, whether it's correlation, causation is up for debate, between Trump's odds of winning and the 10-year Treasury yield over the last 3 months or so. That certainly broke down at the end of last week, where Trump's betting odds started to fall and you still saw the 10-year Treasury yield moving higher. We think the source of that 10-year Treasury yield moving higher really comes down to the bond market digesting the fact that you have a relatively resilient economy that is supported by higher deficit spending, at the same time as you have a Fed that's talking about potentially hundreds of basis points of cuts to get to their idea of neutral, which could have the potential of effectively throwing lighter fluid on some of this tightness within the economy, the fact that you still have overall easy financial conditions as well. And that seems to be the reason why you're seeing these bond yields move higher, not necessarily the election or just the election.
The why is important, Cameron. The why is important because I think it dictates how to trade equities, to some extent at least. Would you say yields have been rising then for good reasons and not bad? And is it a reason to stay long equity markets?
I think the answer to that is in high yield spreads. If yields were rising for bad reasons, that the Fed was tightening policy and it would eventually result in much weaker growth, you would see high yield spreads widening out. But they continue to remain very contained and actually making new year-to-date lows, which says to us this is not a market that is necessarily in fear of growth. It's not priced for a growth slowdown. Now, you could see that as a risk going into 2025 if you start to see a deterioration in economic fundamentals. But effectively, the credit market is telling you that yields are rising because growth is resilient. So watch those high yield spreads very closely.
Would you expect it to remain that way even if we got a sweep from the GOP in the next 24 hours?
I don't necessarily know if any of the policies that would be enacted by a GOP sweep would necessarily affect growth in 2025. Let's put tariffs and potentially immigration to a side, because that is certainly something we could see without a GOP sweep. But the question and the risk for a GOP sweep really is something that's contemplated later in 25 and into 26, where we will be negotiating those $4 trillion of tax cuts, potentially adding a lot to the deficit, which is certainly something that the bond markets might push back on, but that's not necessarily something that we deal with in the next couple of months.
Cameron, a couple of months ago, people who came on this show talked a lot about how this could be a transformative event, how this could mark the difference in an economic cycle with respect to inflation, with respect to growth. As we've gotten closer to the event, people have revised that view. Suddenly people are saying, actually, we just need to get past it, and whatever the result, things will keep on going on the way they were before. Where do you fall on that?
The best news that we always try to bring clients back to is that if you look historically, that the S&P 500, regardless of the power balance within DC, has been able to do what it does despite of or in spite of what goes on in DC. And that's really good news, which just means that overall corporate earnings have been able to operate in times regardless of uncertainty and pressures of what's going on within policy. And it's something that we always try to remind clients of, just so that the way that they don't respond too emotionally to what is, for many people, a very emotional election day.
Cameron, we know the markets like certainty. What if it is a contested election? What's going to be the impact?
Certainly, that would be potentially a source of volatility. It's not necessarily volatility that would last for a long time. So it gets back to Jonathan's first question of, if you do see volatility, is it viable? We think the answer is yes, that as you start to digest some of these deteriorations in breadth and momentum that could be happening regardless of the election, you get the narrative of uncertainty behind it, then you set up for effectively a great buying opportunity into year end with that potential Santa Claus rally and year end chase. So a source of volatility, not necessarily a source of investment decision.
A good framework for thinking about this market into year-end and beyond. Cameron, thank you. Cameron Dawson there of New Edge Wealth. If you are just joining us, bond yields higher at the moment, up by 4 basis points now, Lisa, approaching 4.33. So taping back some of that rally from yesterday.
Basically, nobody knows anything, and basically people are trying to de-risk and then re-risk. And what you can see, maybe this tracks the predicted odds or some of the other prediction markets odds that do show Trump once again gaining a slight edge. Other people people say that these markets are completely skewed and don't listen to them at all. I will just say this. I do think it's important to take notice of that auction yesterday. It was a messy one, and it was a 3-year note auction. We've got a 10-year one today, a 30-year one tomorrow. Supply is going to be harder to digest in a time of incredible uncertainty.
What's that Spider-Man meme when they're sort of looking at each other and doing that? Do you know that one?
I do, but I don't really know.
Okay, never mind, Lisa.
But that's
Equity futures positive, up by a little bit on the S&P. We'll park that. Let's get you an update on stories elsewhere this morning with your Bloomberg brief. Here's Danny Berger. Hey, Danny.
Hey, John. Boeing employees have voted to accept a new labor contract, bringing to an end a crippling 7-week strike. Nearly 60% of workers voted in favor of the new deal. It will see wages increase by 38% over 4 years and enhanced retirement contributions. Hourly workers start returning to factories in several states as soon as Wednesday. The breakthrough marks a big win for the new CEO, Kelly Ortberg, as he aims to rebuild the company's culture and improve the quality of work in its factories. Goldman Sachs will add the most executives to its partnership program in the era of David Solomon. The promotions will be announced this week, and people familiar tell us that they will exceed the prior high of Solomon's 80 people in 2022. It's a big shift for the chief executive, who had preferred a smaller partner class to reinforce the aspirational nature of the rank. This time, Goldman had to both replenish its pool of partners who've left and is enjoying a spell of performance breakout. Monday evening, Joe Rogan announced his endorsement for former President Trump. In a post on X, the popular podcaster praised the, quote, great and powerful Elon Musk, saying he made the most compelling case for Trump you'll ever hear. The endorsement could offer a boost to the Trump campaign, given Rogan's popularity among young men, a key voter demographic for the candidate. And that's your brief. John.
Danny, thank you. When we look back at everything, when all is said and done, I do wonder if we'll look back at that as a big missed opportunity for Kamala Harris to sit down with Joe Rogan.
She had to go to his studio, which was part of the problem, and their election scheduling, but she chose to go at SNL. And if you're watching SNL, which is definitely more old school, less new age, you're probably voting for her. Joe Rogan would have put her in front of 15 million men. And this is a source that actually she needs to shore up.
We'll see if we're talking about this tomorrow morning or not. Up next on the program, the Morning Calls Plus, we'll go to the critical swing states of Georgia and North Carolina. That's all around the corner. Up next, after the commercial break, this is Bloomberg.
Investors, top executives, global innovators. Join me for in-depth conversations with the biggest newsmakers on the day's top stories. Insight with Haslinda Amin, only on Bloomberg.
David Weston. Join me for the next generation of Wall Street Week, telling stories of capitalism from business, markets, economics, tech, and climate. Each week, we'll go on the road for a look at what lies behind the headlines of today and what will likely be the headlines tomorrow.
Above all else, it's a mission.
It's done nothing but grow immensely. To me, that's an extraordinary sign.
We can be the change that we want to see.
Watch the all-new Wall Street Week. More than what you need to know, it's what you need to think about.
There is this real momentum from Wall Street. We are basically deep in the European earnings season.
Take a look at how we're faring when it comes to Asian markets.
The open about 1 hour and 13 minutes away. Equity futures on the S&P up by 0.1%. In the bond market, yields higher by 4 or 5 basis points. The 10-year 4, 33. Let's get you some morning calls. First up, Wedbush raising its price target on Palantir to 57, highlighting its robust quarter and accelerated deal momentum. Your second call from Bernstein, upgrading eBay to outperform, saying the recent pullback in shares offers a better entry point. That stock is up by 1.5%. And finally, JP Morgan raising its price target on Dollar Tree to 82, emphasizing its commitment to a formal review of strategic alternatives for Family Dollar. That stock is up by 4%. Let's turn back to the election with two battleground states in focus. We've got team coverage with Bloomberg's Brett Pulley in Atlanta, Georgia, and Anna Edgerton in Raleigh, North Carolina. Let's get to you first, Anna. Can you walk us through how well things are turning out in North Carolina, just in terms of the process, given how hurricane hit the western part of the state was only a month or so ago?
Yeah, we've actually seen remarkable turnout in those western states that were devastated by Hurricane Helene. Of the 25 counties that were impacted, only 3 had turnout rates in early voting that were below the state average. Across the state, we see Republicans and Democrats taking a really different strategy to their ground game. Republicans have focused much more on community, on their grassroots activists, saying that they have more trust from their friends and family to get out and convince them to vote for Donald Trump. Democrats have a really impressive army of volunteers here. They say they've had 45,000 people sign up to volunteer since Kamala Harris became the nominee. And those volunteers, they said, have knocked on 1.7 million doors across the state. I talked to 2 of those volunteers yesterday, and they said they're still finding undecided voters. And they are able to talk to them about Kamala Harris, tell them about her as a candidate, and encourage them to get out and vote today. We're going to look and see the turnout from both parties and that really crucial block of unaffiliated voters here in North Carolina.
Brett, let's bring you in. In 2020, Biden became the first Democrat to win Georgia since Bill Clinton in 1992. What does the ground game look like in this crucial state for both camps?
Well, both of the candidates have certainly focused a lot here in Georgia. They closed out on Sunday former President Trump in Macon and Kamala Harris in Atlanta, and that was those were both one of many, many appearances. You know, it's unusually foggy and low visibility here in Atlanta today, which of course is Georgia's largest city. But it seems that one thing that voters, I think, across Georgia can certainly see is an end in sight to what has really been a tumultuous campaign, especially here in this state. It feels like, as you alluded to, it's been going on since 2020. Of course, this is a place where the former president committed the alleged crime of asking to find more votes, and this is also where President Biden was like a deer in the proverbial headlights during the debate, which led to Kamala Harris being on the top of the ticket. Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger said yesterday that people in the state have already voted in tremendous numbers, over 4 million people during early voting, another 1.1 million expected today, and it should be interesting.
So when will we find the results, Brett, of Georgia? Because, of course, we all remember the recount that took place. When will we get the final results from the state?
Well, look, 80% of the counties are required. They say about 80% will have their votes into the Secretary of State's office within 1 hour after the polls close this evening at 7 p.m. And so it looks like the votes will come in. The big question is, to what extent will it be contended? There are a lot of things that have been put in place by the state's election board, which is mostly Republican controlled as of recently. That could lead to potential challenges. There have been legal challenges in the courts in recent days. Yesterday, the Republican Party won a challenge asking that relatively, I think, small number of votes not be counted because they were absentee ballots that will not get back in time, that will actually mailed out too late as a result of problems within that county. So there are all kinds of things kind of hanging in the balance that, depending upon the outcome, could make it a long long time before we know.
And we are being prepared for that and hunkering down for that. Anna, from your vantage point in North Carolina, it's a state that Donald Trump has gone to a number of times, repeatedly over the past few weeks. I'm just curious what you're watching. Is it the suburbs? Is it the urban areas? Are there specific sectors? What intel are you hearing on the ground?
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting point because this was the only swing state that Donald Trump won in 2020, although it was his most narrow victory. And so the fact that he has spent so much time here, 2 rallies on Saturday, 1 on Sunday, another one yesterday, shows that his campaign is not taking anything for granted. We will be looking at those ring counties around suburban area, around metro areas, these suburban counties that have changed a lot since the 2020 election. There have been hundreds of thousands of people moving to the state, registering to vote. And so the big question is whether they're going to vote more like the rural counties they used to be or more like the suburban counties they're quickly becoming. So that's going to be really important. Also watching Republican turnout today. Republicans had a really strong showing in early voting. And the question is whether or not those are people who would have voted anyway today or if Donald Trump is converting new voters to his cause in his campaign this year.
I think we all know someone who's moved to North Carolina in the last 12 months. I know several people.
Do you
Anna,
really?
thank you. Yeah, really. Anna Edgerton, Brett Pulley, to the two of you, thank you. I'm pleased Brett brought up the debate back in July. I just imagine, and I can't get into the heads of people, none of us can, of course, although some of you claim to, but I can't. If Biden and Trump agree on one thing, it's that they wish they never did that debate back in July, for sure.
And if Harris wins, the Trump campaign is going to look at the potential errors along the course, and that would be number one. Why did they agree to this debate before the RNC, before the DNC? Because can you imagine that debate was in September or October before this election? Biden's poll numbers fell off a cliff. The donors were calling and saying there needs to be a change. Speaker Pelosi basically said, we're still waiting for your decision. Until it's the right decision, we're not going to accept it. That debate was seismic for this election cycle because it meant they're no longer the incumbent president was at the top of the ticket, and it brought in Kamala Harris, who then had to re-identify herself, but also it brought fresh enthusiasm and a ton more money. We're talking about all this ad money in Pennsylvania across the swing states, $1.8 billion, is it? Well, guess what? All of that fresh money was coming because of that change, because of that debate.
They were most passionate about the golf game. I can just imagine if they had really continued on that vein, if it had been those two candidates, we'd hear a lot about, no, you don't have that bogey, give me a break. I mean, we'd hear a lot of that, I think, coming out of the campaign. And instead, it's a little bit different. I will just say, it does highlight how topsy-turvy this entire campaign season has been.
Hasn't Donald Trump been going after Mark Cuban's golf game as well?
It's a very sensitive point, I hear.
Very sensitive, low club head speed. Apparently.
Are we going to ask him about that? Is that you're going to open it up? Do you have a low head?
Just absolutely ridiculous, the whole thing has been. We have got some economic data for you in about 5 minutes' time. We've got the trade balance a little bit later this morning. And then later on at 10 a.m. Eastern time, some important data. ISM services for the month of October. I know a lot of this is being overlooked this month for obvious reasons, but that's an important data point this week.
Yeah, big question about whether you can continue with the expansion, and kind of to the point that Kelsey Barrow was making, are we slowing down? Is this an economy, if you take a look at the averages, that actually is losing a bit of its momentum? I love this quote. I have to just read it to you.
Sure.
From Jason Thomas over at Carlisle. Like a tree falling in the woods when there's no one there to hear it. The Fed convenes this week for the second to last FOMC meeting of the year. There is economic data. There are things that we otherwise would be focusing on. We will be covering it all, but no one seems to be.
We'll have special coverage of Fed Decision Day.
We will.
Right here on Thursday. I might have to change ties, but I'll still be here. Same suit, everything. Not leaving.
This will be fun.
In the next 30 minutes, Neil Data of Renmac, and we'll catch up with the Dallas Mavericks minority owner, Mark Cuban from New York. This is Bloomberg.
studios in New York and San Francisco, our expert hosts have the data and analysis about the companies you know and the startups to watch, plus the interviews you don't want to miss. Watch Caroline Hyde and Ed Ludlow on Bloomberg Technology, the only daily business show dedicated to tech, right in the middle of the trading action, every weekday, only on Bloomberg Television. Context changes everything.
As we spend some time here on the broader presidential race,
let's focus in on European politics.
Makes you wonder how politics might play out.
Get your fixed income fix. Watch Bloomberg Real Yield every Friday right here on Bloomberg. Context changes everything. The countdown is on. Everything you need to get the edge at the end of the market day.
Big tech earnings kick off later this afternoon.
Gilead is coming out right now.
We have take two numbers. Back to the markets, right? Our bread and butter.
NVIDIA is one of the best stories in the tech space.
That actually matters a whole lot more.
It might shock some of your viewers.
You're watching The Close.
Get ahead of tomorrow's trading with The Close. Weekdays on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Economic data drops in about 20 seconds' time. Equity futures going into that positive by 0.2%, up by a third on the Nasdaq 100. In the bond market, big move to start the week. Big rally. Treasury yields aggressively lower across the curve. We bounce back a little bit right now. We're up by 4 basis points. The 10-year 432.72, up 3 at the front end of the curve. The 2-year up to 419.10. Around the table with us, Mike McKee with some breaking economic data. Good morning, Mike.
Good morning. Economic data back in the news. Who'd have thought it? I mean, but Thursday, reminder, we get the Fed again. $84.4 billion for the trade deficit, which is just a little bit higher than anticipated. 84 flat was the survey number. 70.8 is the revised prior month. Now, we basically knew these numbers because they give us the advance, but it does tell you a reason why growth was a little bit slower than had been anticipated. This took some of the growth out of the United States, but it is going to be interesting for the Fed on Thursday because we're going to be asking about this, and we're going to be asking, well, if we don't know the winner, and if the winner is not Harris, then we're going to be asking about tariffs. The Fed did model in 2018 what would happen with tariffs because Trump was putting tariffs on at the time. They predicted it. Inflation jumps, consumer spending falls, business spending falls, markets go down because lower earnings is in prospect. So they could either their model said we could either raise rates to deal with the higher inflation, and that would probably lead to recession, or we could look through it and hope that the inflation is short-lived. And if it's not, then we got to raise rates anyway. So it's a tough dilemma for them. And they don't. This was a staff forecast.
Yeah.
They don't know what they would do, and they don't know how bad it would be, but it wouldn't be a good thing.
You'll be there on Thursday. Mike McKee, let's bring in Neil Dutter of Renmac to weigh in on some of the economic data we've seen. And Neil, look ahead to that Federal Reserve decision on Thursday. How straightforward is this for the Federal Reserve on Thursday, and does it get harder in December?
Well, in my opinion, no, it does not. I mean, I think we should expect rate cuts at each of the next two meetings, and I think 25 basis points is a lock. My only thing to say about December is at the moment the markets are priced about 20% for a skip. I think that could shift a little bit towards, I think the left side of the distribution, meaning, I wouldn't be surprised for the markets to start pricing in a 50 basis point cut in December. I'm not saying that's what they will end up doing, but I think in terms of distribution of probabilities, cutting more is more likely than not cutting at all. So that's sort of how I'm thinking about it. The labor markets are clearly slowing.
Neil, do you feel like this economy is kind of on a path that right now is not going to get disrupted by the election joy that we've been experiencing? Or do you think that this really is a decisive moment that could alter that economic trajectory?
I mean, in my career, I just tend to tune out the political noise. I mean, yes, things can change in terms of fiscal policy, but I think it's not wise for the Fed to sort of front run these potential outcomes. You know, I know there's been a lot of ink spilled on the so-called Trump trade in the financial markets, right? This idea that, you know, the sort of tax cut extension, tariffs, less immigration will push up dollar and bond yields and so forth. But, you know, I think it's important just to kind of take a step back, think about, you know, the sort of sequencing of events here. I mean, if you go back to the first time he was in office, you know, tariffs weren't actually the first thing that was happening. I mean, the first thing that was happening was very market-friendly type stuff, right? Like deregulation and tax cuts and you know, no matter what happens, I think you know, the markets seem to be saying more of a chance of a unified sort of GOP government. I mean, I think the race is a coin flip, frankly, but it's not like they're going to be able to steamroll whatever it is they want through the Congress, because the Congress will still be very, very evenly divided, even if the GOP wins, particularly in the House. So I just think that there's a little bit too much, you know, kind of inflation risk premium baked in from a potential Trump win.
Neil, that final point, a really important one. We'll leave it there. Neil Dutta of Renmac on the US election and on the economic data and the Federal Reserve meeting that we've got to take place on Thursday. Let's keep it there on the US election. Kamala Harris outraising Donald Trump by nearly 5-1 among big donors in the final stages of the campaign. One wealthy individual supporting Harris is Mark Cuban, the minority owner of the Dallas Mavericks, and I'm pleased to say that Mark joins us now. Mark, welcome to the program. We spoke to a Trump campaign advisor a little bit early this morning, and I want to start with you in a similar way that I started with him, which is basically, I'm waking up this morning, I'm a swing state voter, I'm in Pennsylvania state, and I still haven't decided who I'm going to vote for, and I'm thinking back to how Harris talked about in 2019 that she wanted to ban fracking. I understand she's changed her mind, but I'm worried that she's a bit of a shapeshifter. She gets back into power and she'll change her mind again. How do you settle those concerns?
The world has changed since 2019. She's open-minded. She's talked openly about the fact that she wants to give dissenting opinions a place at the table with her. She's not dogmatic. That's how you explain it. And she's looking to put together the best policy. She said in 2020 that she supported fracking. So I think that's a non-issue. And in terms of, you know, is she just an extension of Biden? Just look at Biden's budget proposal versus what Kamala Harris has actually proposed. Biden wanted much higher taxes. Kamala Harris came in at 28% for tax rate for cap gains and 28% for corporation, and did not say a word and will not say a word about unrealized capital gains. And so I think she's completely different. She's not a shapeshifter in the least bit.
Well, that individual we were speaking to, Scott Bessent, this key economic policy advisor to the Trump campaign, says that Harris, what he hears from a lot of Wall Street journals, that she would be moderated by a Republican Senate. And that's why Wall Street would be willing to vote for her, because of that moderating effect that she would get from a red Senate. Is there any truth to that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, balance is not a bad thing necessarily. I'm not opposed to a divided Congress. You know, but the bottom line is, what will Kamala Harris do? And I think she's better for the economy in so many ways. You know, there's 335 million people in this country. 4 million make $400,000 or more. The other 330 million make less. And she's been very specific that if you make $400,000 or less, your taxes aren't going up. In fact, for 100 million people, they're going down. The other big expense that every household is fearful of is healthcare expenses. Donald Trump has said he has a concept of a plan. Kamala Harris has been very specific on the pharmaceutical side, saying she's going after the pharmacy benefit managers, the middlemen, and she'll introduce transparency. I know from my own personal experiences with cost-plus drugs, that'll lead to a 20-30% or more deduction in the cost of medications for households and businesses. And then you've got tariffs. As Michael, I think it was, said earlier, tariffs are a bad idea. I mean,
well, if they're so bad, then why did Biden and Kamala Harris keep them? They keep the Trump-era
Well, let's talk about that, right? Because that's not completely accurate. First, look at the EU. Biden signed a deal saying that there would be no tariffs between the two, EU and the United States, for the next 5 years. So those tariffs are gone. And then you look at what Trump tried to introduce. He had 4 years to try to implement tariffs that worked, and he got his butt kicked by China. The retaliatory tariffs almost destroyed the soybean and the farming industry, and he had to pay out $20 million. But as it applies to households, right? He's talking about a 60% across the board tariffs for Chinese imports. China makes just about every Christmas present that we buy for our kids. So families would be looking at a 60% or more increase in what they'd spend on Christmas, and the downstream impact of that would be significant to small and large businesses.
Mark, let's talk about something you've been very vocal on. This is regulation. You've said that you don't think Harris should keep Lina Khan at the head of the FTC on. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the congresswoman from New York, went to Twitter and she said billionaires like you, Mark, are trying to play footsie with the ticket. And if anyone goes near Lina Khan, there will be, quote, an out-and-out brawl. Where is Harris when it comes to things like the FTC?
I don't know. I haven't talked about personnel with her or her team. I have no intention about talking about personnel. You know, I was asked a question about what I thought about the FTC, and I thought that, you know, the possibility of breaking up the big technology companies would be a negative, because I think, you know, winning the AI battle for the United States is paramount from a military and an economic perspective. So I voiced my opinion, but I'm not involved in those conversations at all.
But it really raises this ultimate question, which is what policies will she follow? She's been engaging with AOC quite a bit in terms of the campaign trail. And there's a real question of how much there will be an effort to cater to the further left sides of the Democratic wing versus the sort of centrist appeal that she's been trying to have. How much are you actually getting confidence that she's going to have business executives in cabinet positions, in top areas where she really is listening to what they have to say?
I talk to her campaign almost every day. I'm 100% certain. I'm not just confident. I'm certain that that's what they're going to do. I've been on the trail with Doug Emhoff, who, as part of his presentation, talks about what a capitalist she is. She's talked about, you know, wanting to create 25 million new businesses. That's not a reflection of anything far left. She, one of the first things she did was introduce a tax deduction or increase the tax deduction for startup costs to $50,000. That's very important. She recognizes that of the 33 million companies in this country, 99% are passed through, 99% are run by people making $400K or less. Those small businesses are what drive the economy. They create most of the new jobs every single year. So she's focused on an opportunity economy. I don't think she can be any more clear.
Mark, do you think that this campaign for Kamala Harris could have done more to reach out to the male voter? This seems to be an election that is unique in just how bifurcated the male and the female vote really has been. There were some questions around Joe Rogan and how to appeal to the male vote and how to really bring the genders together. What's your take on this campaign's approach to that?
I think it was very data-driven. I mean, women have a higher propensity of voting, and, you know, with reproductive rights and other issues that were geared towards women, I think she did a great job of connecting to them. You know, maybe she didn't do everything she could have with men, but that's okay, because she went to the people who are going to vote more. You go, you know, as a business person, you go to the people you have the best opportunity to sell to. Who's going to buy your product? Who's going to vote for you in this particular case? And the fact that she's only been in the race 14 weeks and she's caught up completely, and now I believe passed her and will win today, I think she's done the exact right thing.
Mark, speaking of business and product, there's a famous quote from Michael Jordan, which I'm sure you know well. Republicans buy sneakers too. It raised a question about you, and I wanted to ask you about this. For a man who's got a line of businesses, why was this important to you to put your name and reputation on the line and really get deep into politics when ultimately Republicans buy sneakers too?
So I'm not going to get deep into politics, but I think this, you know, this is a close election for a reason. And I think Kamala Harris will be the best president and is a better choice than Donald Trump. It's that simple. I mean, I love this country. I'm in this position because of everything this country has given me. I'm blessed. And I thought, you know, I truly believe that she will be the better president for the United States of America. And that's the only reason I'm doing this.
Well, thank you for sharing your time with us this morning. We appreciate it, Mark, and hopefully we can catch up again soon. Mark Cuban there on the latest campaign effort from the Harris campaign.
Yeah, I really think he's the Elon Musk, closest thing to Elon Musk from that the Democrats have. And it's a great question you ask, because if you're a business individual, I mean, he says he's not getting deep into politics. Well, he's not a politician, but he is deep into politics. I mean, he is one of their biggest surrogates on the Harris campaign, and he's spending a lot of time and a lot of money trying to get her elected.
Certainly deep into campaigning. Your thoughts on your question and the answer you got to it about the male vote?
Well, following the numbers, the fact that women vote more than men, which is something that a lot of people have been talking about and leaning into, I don't know what the answer is, but I do think that there is a reckoning after this election about how divided male and female voters really are in this country. And I don't know all the answers, but I really want those discussions. I want to hear them, and I want to listen to what people have to say, because it is so notable, and I think that aspect has been unprecedented.
I think we all share that view. If you are just joining us, equity futures on the S&P up by 0.2%, with an update on stories elsewhere this morning. With your Bloomberg brief, let's cross over to Danny Berger. Hey, Danny.
Hey, John, a check on Palantir shares this morning, up 17% pre-market. It reported quarterly revenue that beat analyst estimates. It also raised its forecast for operating income in the current period. It cited higher demand in the U.S. for its AI software. Shares of Palantir are up 140% so far this year. Apple is exploring a push into smart glasses, setting the stage for the company to compete with Meta. According to people with knowledge of the matter, the tech giant began an internal study codenamed Atlas last week, which involved gathering feedback from Apple employees on smart glasses. More focus groups are planned for the near future. Meanwhile, shares of Wynn, those are falling 2% pre-market. The casino operator reported adjusted EPS for the third quarter that missed the average estimate. That was largely driven by the company's operations in Macau. Profits there were 10% below expectations. Wynn also said it had approved a buyback of up to 1 billion shares. The company's CEO saying that the results reflect healthy demand across its resorts. And that's your Bloomberg Brief. John.
Hey, Danny, thank you. And welcome to the program to all of you. If you are just joining us, equity futures right now on the S&P 500 up by 0.2%. Just a flavour of the bond market for you. Yields are higher by more than 4 basis points now on a 10-year, 4.32. Some important economic data about an hour from now. You get a PMI in the United States. Then 15 minutes after that, an ISM services read in America, which I keep saying, Lisa, and I know you agree, that's an important data point for this economy and for this market.
It has been the pillar that has really been holding up a lot of the engine of growth. It has not been in the manufacturing sector, which has been in recession. Key question, can you see that expansion continue at a time where we heard from Kelsey Barrow, we heard also from Veronica Clark over at Morgan Stanley. There is a real, over at Citigroup, there's a real question about just how much momentum is in this economy.
Up next on the program, we'll set you up for the day ahead, a very long day, and a week ahead, and maybe the month ahead, and we'll take you back to both candidates' headquarters as election day gets underway.
Many global investors that aren't interested in China anymore, but there's a lot that are. And obviously the local investors have money in China and are doubling down on investing in China. Many of the Asian investors, and in fact a lot of the Middle East investors, the Americans are gone away. Therefore, there's an amazing opportunity to put capital to work and get returns which are excess what you would get in other places. Where there is lack of money, there is usually opportunity. So we continue to build out our business in China. It's just where the money's coming from is different. And so we're raising local money in China for investing and bringing those that choose to be there to invest in China. So it's just a different, where the money's coming from is just different.
Welcome to the world of decentralized finance.
We thought we'd take a look at Bitcoin versus the S&P 500.
Bloomberg's covering all things crypto, the people.
The tectonic shift emanating from Washington.
It's really a tale of two cities in crypto.
Crypto shouldn't be partisan.
The transactions.
Really a record-breaking moment.
Crypto VC is back.
And the technology.
It's really the beginning of a global on-chain economy.
And if America doesn't embrace it, we're going to be left behind.
Bloomberg Crypto, only on Bloomberg.
Good morning. This is Bloomberg Surveillance.
Welcome back to the opening trade.
This is Bloomberg Technology.
This is the Asia Trade.
You're watching the close. Welcome to Balance of Power.
This is Bloomberg.
Bringing you up-to-the-minute financial news whenever and wherever it happens. I'm Michael McKee at the Federal Reserve, and this is Bloomberg.
.42 minutes until the opening bell, with equity futures up by 0.2%, yields higher by 4 basis points, the 10-year 432.31. As we count you down to the opening bell, here's the trading diary for the rest of this week. Today, the US presidential election, plus US PMI data. Thursday, the Fed rate decision and another round of jobless claims, plus a rate decision from the BOE. And on Friday, if you're still around for this, you missed consumer sentiment data on Friday morning. Can you imagine being around for that?
10 a.m. I'm going to be sitting at my desk.
I'll still be waiting for numbers from Pennsylvania.
Exactly.
On Friday.
Are we going to get the ultimate consumer data when we find out the results of this election?
Yeah, nothing else matters after that, that's for sure. Let's turn back to the top story, Election Day in America. Our team coverage of the Trump and Harris campaigns for a final word. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall in Florida, Skylar Woodhouse in Washington. Tyler, first to you. Walk us through the former president's day ahead of him.
Yeah, hey, John. So right now we are waiting to get inside the Palm Beach Convention Center. Security is incredibly high here. Secret Service doing their sweeps before former President Donald Trump arrives for his election night watch party tonight. But before those results, before that watch party, this election could really come down to which candidate did a better job of convincing Americans that they are best for the economy. When we talk about Trump's closing arguments, we saw him on the campaign trail yesterday doing what he calls his signature weave, but also at the same time trying to hammer home his own economic vision. For example, just yesterday, introducing a new threat of heightened tariffs against Mexico. So clearly trying to capitalize on this sentiment that we're seeing, that despite some recent bright spots and economic indicators, the economy remains the top issue for voters. And our Bloomberg News Morning Consult polling shows us that former President Donald Trump is currently leading Vice President Kamala Harris when it comes to voter confidence on the economy by about 5 percentage points. It is important to note, though, that in that same poll when he was running against President Biden, that gap was 14 percentage points. So clear that Vice President Kamala Harris has made some inroads when it comes to this issue, but that former President Donald Trump clearly holds the edge still when it comes to the economy.
Skylar, last night we saw the vice president physically knocking on doors in Pennsylvania, basically asking people for their votes in these final moments. What's she doing today?
The vice president is hunkered down here in D.C. today. She's at her residence at the Naval Observatory. For the pool, the call time is not until this afternoon. And what we know is that she will be doing media rounds with radio stations across all 7 swing states. So she is still out there, doing the media rounds, trying to connect with those last-minute voters in those key battlegrounds. But she, for the most part, will be hunkered down today, and we most likely won't see her until the election night festivities at Howard University, her alma mater. But the campaign really has been only in this race for a little bit more than 100 days. And last night, one of her senior campaign officials said that they are confident that Vice President Harris will win all 7 battlegrounds. And that was coming from David Plouffe, who ran Barack Obama's 2008 presidential campaign. And that is, potentially some wishful thinking. But I think one thing the campaign has done, that they've struck this balance, and even Harris has said it herself, that they are the underdogs, but they have a lot of momentum. So it'll be interesting to see how all of that momentum does play out with the first poll set to close in less than 12 hours. And I think that we will see from the campaign how that momentum really plays out.
Tyler, what are you looking for in terms of what the Trump camp wants to see before they either declare victory or potentially sort of cede the election?
Right, exactly. So in recent days leading up to this, we've seen former President Donald Trump tell his supporters that this is their election to lose, despite all of the polls showing us that this is going to be an incredibly close race. That sort of rhetoric is raising concerns that he might contest the election results before they are even called, or if they are not called in his favor. It's important to point out that Trump and his allies filed at least 60 different lawsuits in the wake of the 2020 elections. Both sides of the aisle are gearing up for any potential litigation when it comes to this. We know the RNC as well as the DNC has been fundraising heavily, raising millions of dollars for any potential battles. And I would just quickly point you to a recent Bloomberg News analysis, which found that 165 lawsuits were filed between 2023 and today, Election Day, on everything from mail-in ballots to early voting. So it does appear that both sides could be gearing up for a potential litigation fight going into this week.
Expect and brace for more of that later on this evening. Tyler Kendall, Skylar Woodhouse, to the both of you. Thank you. Special coverage later on this evening. Election night 2024, 7 p.m. Eastern Time, right here on Bloomberg TV. The Bloomberg team at the election map, Katie Lyons, following the House and Senate races, Joe Matthew. On the markets, Lisa, Danny Berger, and Anne-Marie trying to keep us all awake a little bit later.
Yeah, all awake for this evening and then potentially the rest of the week. You know, Tyler there was talking about the number one issue being the economy, which it has been the entire year. This ranks far and large the biggest issue hitting voters. But then we got this poll over the weekend from Iowa. And this poll came after this summer, Iowa put in one of the most strictest abortion bans we see across the nation. It's 6 weeks. And then you saw this uptick of women going out to vote. And not just young women, women 65 and over. Women who remember when Roe was stated, and now we remember who Dobbs when Roe was taken back. And you can think that this is about the economy, but there is this potential that these pollsters are underestimating the fact that more women are going to go into the polls because of abortion. You saw that in that poll. Remains to be seen whether or not that's going to be a harbinger, foreshadowing what could potentially happen, if there's a pink wave or not. If it's the economy, certainly DJT has the upper hand.
There's an analogy between some of these political polls and some of the results we're getting in and the economic data. In terms of, there are so many different stories behind each person, each industry, each area. The fact that Romaine said that in Michigan, it is foreign policy, it is some of the Muslim communities, as well as some of the Polish communities, where you hear about the economy in some places, and in other places, it's things like abortion. What I am struck by is how everyone has a unique story and has their own community that they forged online or whatever, and how it's so difficult to speak about any of this in some sort of overarching average.
2016, 2020, these polls are won on the margins. Biden won the blue wall with just 77,000 votes. You have to make sure you are going laser sharp into these different groups, which is why when you have maybe an unforced error talking that saying Puerto Rico is an island of garbage, that could hurt you in a place like Pennsylvania, where there's some 500,000 Puerto Ricans living, and maybe some of them are going to go to vote after hearing that.
Let's wrap it up. I need to go to bed, and then I'll see you again at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Coming up tomorrow, we'll still be awake. Anastasia Amoroso of iCapital, Mohammed Al-Erin of Queen's College, Cambridge, former Kansas City Fed President Thomas Hoenig, and Torsten Slok of Apollo. From New York City, that does it for us this morning. We'll see you later on this evening for special coverage of Election Night 2024. With equity futures on the S&P 500 firmer by 0.2%. That does it for us. Thank you for choosing Bloomberg TV. This was Bloomberg Surveillance.
Morning, this is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Tom McKenzie in London. These are the stories that set your agenda.
Taking you from the U.S. market's close to the overnight session in Asia. We'll walk you through what you need to know to kickstart the European trading day. Live from our European headquarters, we bring you the day's top market-moving stories, unmatched expert analysis, and on-the-ground reporting from across the continent. Tune in every weekday at 6 a.m. London time. Only.
You know, Steve was a teacher. He taught me the value of focus, the importance of simplicity, the fact that making things simple is so much harder than making things complex. For those of us that were fortunate enough to work with him, he was the teacher of a lifetime. My first job was delivering papers. And I was about 12 years old, everybody was sort of expected to work in my family. And I'd get up at 3 in the morning, pick up the stack of papers and start throwing. And usually come back and take a nap before school. Throwing papers helped start my college education. And I was the first person in my family that went to college. I knew that being able to do that was a privilege that I needed not to waste. Everyone saw college in those days, and hopefully today, as opening many doors and being able to stand on the shoulders of your parents, that education would do that.
Here's a business strategy. If everything's fine, just keep your head down and execute. Every once in a while, you have a big insight, and you can build an entire business, in fact, an entire industry around it.
Why does this business model work? Because it's virgin space.
I will show you how to get the best funding for your startup idea. Let's get started. Here's the deal. If you have an amazing startup idea and need funds to fuel it, we're here to help. Simply send us a video where you explain your idea. Make it clear, concise, and compelling. Hook us in with your passion and vision. Don't forget to include your contact details so investors can reach out directly. This is your chance to shine and get your idea in front of people who can make it a reality. Imagine turning your startup dream into a thriving business. It all starts with that one simple step. So what are you waiting for? Grab your phone, hit record, and let your idea fly. The future of your startup could be just one video away. Remember, be clear, be passionate, and most importantly, be you. We can't wait to see what you've got. Let's get funded now.
Today's the day! 30 minutes until the start of cash trading on this election day. I'm Matt Miller.
I'm Shanali Bassett.
And I'm Katie Greifeld. Bloomberg Open Interest starts right now.
And coming up today is the day. Election day is finally here. Harris and Trump end one of the most dramatic presidential campaigns in history. It's now down to the voter to decide the winners.
From key market signals to key races to watch, we've got team coverage for you from around the country, as well as reaction from Wall Street and the C-suite.
Plus, Boeing finally reaches a deal with its union workers, ending a strike that's crippled production for almost 2 months. Some needed good news for Boeing. We'll get to all of that and more, but let's take a look at where markets are trading, of course, as we count down to when polls close. You can see the setup right now, it's pretty tepid. The S&P 500 up about 0.1%. The NASDAQ 100, your big tech names, up a little bit more. It's hard to make too much out of these moves, of course, as we await for some clarity here. Hopefully, we'll get it in the next 24 hours or so. You take your look at the bond market right now. A wild day yesterday, a big rally, and now coming back up a little bit. You can see 10-year yields currently higher by about 4 basis points, Matt.
All right, so equity index is still near all-time highs. We've done pretty well after the past couple of presidential elections as well. I've got a chart here that shows the results in equity indexes 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, 1 quarter, and 1 year after. You can see, though, that 2016, for some reason here in yellow, I would have put it in red, 2020 in white, I would have said blue, but 2020 was a better year, or the year following the election for the equity markets than the year following the 2016 election. The same is true, that was the S&P. The same is true for the NASDAQ as well as for the Russell 2000. So regardless of where you look, we had a better year following the 2020 election than we did following the 2016 election.
Optimism all around, Matthew. This is what we depend on you for. We're going to look at some stocks to watch under the surface. Optimism in Boeing, of course, as Katie was talking about, 1.7% higher. Workers voted to accept a new labor contract, ending a strike that crippled the jetliner's production. Of course, Boeing's still down on the year pretty significantly, but a good day for them indeed. Palantir just soaring more than 16.5%, climbing after reporting record profit on strong demand for AI products. Palantir has already been up 141% this year, so adding to those gains in a big way. Ferrari, though, down 5.7%, lower after shipments of luxury cars declined in the third quarter, Matt.
All right, and of course, there's a lot to talk about other than the election.
Well, it's your birthday.
No, it is my birthday, and really, we wouldn't have had anything to talk about other than the election.
True.
But Boeing workers came back from strike yesterday.
They
You
did.
must be so excited.
I'm sure that Kelly Ortberg is pretty excited here, too. Maybe the Biden administration. We know that, of course, Julie Su has been involved in those talks. Let's talk about the election, though.
Okay.
I mean, we've been drumbeating for months and months. We're finally here. And it was Cameron Dawson, actually. She made a good point on surveillance earlier that you think about how close polls are, 50-50. Any surprise, any outcome is going to be a little bit of a shock.
And with the economy being such a hot topic on people's radars, we have to remember that in those swing states, the economic realities are different on the ground. You know, guys, in Nevada and Michigan, the jobless rate is actually higher than the national average. So it will be interesting to see who comes out to the polls, who they vote for with those realities in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's continue to focus on this election coverage, shall we? I mean, why not? What else are we going to talk about today,
We could talk
right?
about earnings. We could talk about the Fed. We're going to get to all of that. But we have reporters stationed across the country right now from all the swing states, from both campaign headquarters. Let's get to it now with Bloomberg's Skylar Woodhouse. She has been following the Harris campaign in Washington. We also have Philippe Marquez with the Trump campaign in Florida. Skylar, we're going to start with you on the Harris campaign. Of course, you've been following it closely over the past couple months, and she's only been in the race since July. Talk to us about the culmination and how Kamala Harris and her team will be spending the last few hours here.
So Vice President Kamala Harris, she is hunkered down here in Washington. She got back to D.C. early in the morning after her final rally in Philadelphia. She was barnstorming Pennsylvania all day yesterday to try and shore up those final votes in the must-win battleground for the return to the White House. And she is here in D.C. today. She will be hosting her election night festivities at Howard University. And, you know, I think the campaign, like you just said, they haven't had a ton of time with specifically Harris. Now, they were on board for Biden, but since Harris has taken over, they've really had to hit the ground running, from, you know, mobilizing voters to learn who Vice President Kamala Harris is as she stands as her own candidate. And so, you know, that will all come together tonight. As polls close, we'll see where the results come in. But, you know, I think that the campaign is feeling the momentum. We've heard from top Harris advisors who have said, you know, that they are pretty confident that they'll get the win. Some even saying that Harris could potentially win all 7 swing states. Now that's wishful thinking, but we will see how the results turn out. I mean, I just want to highlight here the Des Moines, Iowa poll from over the weekend shows Harris up 3 percentage points. And even on some other national polls, former President Donald Trump is losing the edge he did have in the earlier marks of the campaign. So the Harris campaign is definitely seeing things maybe looking positive, but they have been striking a balance of continuing to say we are the underdogs and knowing that it's still going to be a tough battle.
Felipe, let's bring you in here as well. What is the tone on the ground at the Trump campaign?
Well, first of all, as you can see, I have this very dreary background in front of me. No palm trees, nothing that would suggest that I'm in Palm Beach. But it's because we can't be at the convention center right now. It's getting ready for tonight's big party. I mean, it's striking the difference between what Skylar just described, right? Like, I spent the night talking to a couple of Republican operatives, and they are sure that Donald Trump's going to win. They say that early voting data points out that he has a large margin for victory. They're very optimistic. They were very energized by Joe Rogan's endorsement last night. They think the Iowa poll was a fluke. I mean, so obviously they are very, very optimistic with their chances. There's still one very important thing left for Donald Trump to do today, which is cast his own ballot. He's expected to do it by late this morning, and then he leaves to Mar-a-Lago, where he's going to host a couple tele rallies. So for tonight's big event, we're going to do it at the West Palm Beach Convention Center. Trump's going to spend most of his time in Mar-a-Lago. So there's going to be the convention center, a VIP area at the convention center, and even more the VIP area at Mar-a-Lago, but to be in Mar-a-Lago, you have to be part of his inner circle or have a membership. Remember that now memberships are at 1 million each as of October. So I guess that's going to be probably the very top of his donors and advisors.
All right, Felipe, thanks very much for joining us. Felipe Marquez there in Palm Beach, Skylar Woodhouse in Washington, D.C. I want to get to our guest right now, Bridgewater Associates former Chief Investment Strategist Rebecca Patterson here with us on set. Rebecca, you have suggested in the past that Trump threatens the foundations of America's economy and power, and I wonder if the $27 trillion bond market doesn't offer some checks and balances here. I mean, can't the bond vigilantes do something in order to, save a worst case scenario?
I mean, I think our bond market, to your point, $27 trillion is too big for even the biggest traders out there to move the market. But I think it is interesting when you look at former President Trump's policies. They've been estimated by a variety of nonpartisan sources to be relatively more inflationary. So that, all else equal, is going to push up the curve. But secondly, the tariff policies are likely to be inflationary. And then immigration, if he follows through. And all campaign proposals are ifs, right?
Especially on such an incredibly difficult and expensive undertaking. I mean, even with the funding, how would you do it?
Let's say, though, you have a modest number of immigrants going out. The Peterson Institute said if you have 1.3 immigrants leaving, you have the 10% global, 60% China tariffs. Those two things together could lift CPI by 4 percentage points. So you've got the inflation picture. Then supply, if we have these tax cuts, we're going to push up bond supply significantly. And then demand. We're getting about a quarter of demand from foreign investors. If we're putting tariffs on all these foreign investors, are they going to want to continue at the same rate or greater to buy bonds? So I do think there's a risk higher for bond yields on the back of this compendium of Trump policies, if you will. But we'll see. Again, just because you propose it doesn't mean it becomes reality.
And I have a question about the funding. Right now, I think you wrote that 60% of foreign banks' holdings are in treasuries.
Correct.
If they even marginally change that, it would make a huge difference. What asset would they go to? Would they go to euro? Would they go to yuan?
Right. So this is what's saving the treasury market, frankly, over the last several years, is there isn't a great alternative. Investors, especially central bank investors, care about liquidity. They care about transaction cost safety. And there is nothing like the U.S. Treasury market. However, it's a structural risk. If these tariffs are going on, we're not as close with our allies. They are going to see, where else can I go? The biggest one we've seen in the last few years, which you all talk about well and regularly, is gold. China, Russia, a number of emerging market central banks in particular have been adding to their gold reserves in recent years, which is largely why gold is near a record high.
I want to talk a little bit more about the bond market. I want to talk about the action that we've seen so far, because you think about since the end of September, we've seen this fantastic run-up in bond yields, a fantastic run-up in the dollar as well, to bring into currencies. A lot of people have ascribed that to the Trump trade, basically, to Trump's odds of winning. And just to blueprint out a little bit here, if we were to see a Trump victory, how much do you think that it's already priced into these markets?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know exactly to quantify it, but I do think you can say there's some probability of a Trump victory being priced into markets here with the dollar and with treasuries. But thinking about the dollar in particular, the dollar has been rising under the Biden administration too. So it's a big question is what's driving these moves. If you have a Trump or a Harris victory and there's more fiscal stimulus, that can lift the long end of the curve, growth, reflation hopes. If you have a strong U.S. economy and supported equity markets, foreign capital coming into the U.S. can lift the dollar. That's been the story the last few years under a Democrat. So even if Harris wins, and the chances are good, it's so close, I don't necessarily think that means a sustained weaker dollar or sustained lower yields. I think it's a question of degrees, and there's going to be some volatility in the interim.
Rebecca, so much of these policies come down to Congress as well, and especially when you look at the House, it's pretty incredible how tight some of these races are, and the chances that you may not get a red sweep in the House. So what would that mean in terms of the ability to extend fiscal dominance, even if Trump does win?
Right, and I think this is such a great question because investors sometimes focus on a policy, and you need to understand when can the policy get passed, What's the probability of its passage? How impactful is it? So we know, sweep or no sweep, you can do trade. You can do a lot of regulatory. You can do immigration. So if Trump wins, that's likely to happen Jan 2021, right, or get started. The fiscal could take a little longer. Obviously, it has to happen in 2025. If you don't have a sweep for former President Trump, he's still likely to get a lot through, but it's a question for either Harris or Trump how much they could get through in a divided Congress, especially with our budget deficit now closer to 6% of GDP and debt closer to 100% of GDP. There's going to be a lot of pushback. And don't forget, we have debt ceiling, right? Jan 1, we hit the debt ceiling. It'll get extended to late spring or summer, but that's going to be a lever in this political fight that I'm afraid we're also going to be facing next year, whoever wins.
All right, Rebecca, we are just getting started. Stick with us. That is Rebecca Patterson helping us kick off our Election Day coverage. And tonight on Bloomberg, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons will have a 2-hour Balance of Power special to kick off our election night coverage. That's followed by Bloomberg's Election 2024 special beginning at 7 p.m. in New York. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Tom McKenzie in London. These are the stories that set your agenda.
Taking you from the U.S. market's close to the overnight session in Asia. We'll walk you through what you need to know to kickstart the European trading day. Live from our European headquarters, we bring you the day's top market-moving stories, unmatched expert analysis, and on-the-ground reporting from across the continent. Tune in every weekday at 6 a.m. London time, only on Bloomberg Television.
In case you missed it, on Bloomberg Technology.
We're excited to really change the expectations for space companies where you have this always-on, reliable, and frankly dynamic satellite connectivity that you would expect of your power grid or of your cell phones. And so we think that this is a huge opportunity space, and our first contribution to it is through shared infrastructure.
You can see this whole ecosystem developing, and you have an exponential growth right now because easier access to space means more demand for space, and that's the definition of an exponential growth function. So if you think about someone like Varda, who is only possible now because access to space is cheaper and easier, we're demanding more access to space.
I think that's what's so exciting from a business perspective, is the fact that if you can do it, you're one of a few numbers of organizations in the history who've actually pulled it off. And so it creates a very defensible position, because again, space is very, very hard.
Don't miss Bloomberg Technology live every weekday.
Bloomberg loves earnings.
I know it's like your Super Bowl, right?
I can't wait. It's like opening presents in the morning.
All right, it will be exciting.
Nobody covers earnings like Bloomberg. Bloomberg Surveillance covers the latest in global markets and the political events that influence your world. Join Jonathan Farrell, Lisa Abramowitz, and Anne-Marie Hordern only on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
We're back with Rebecca Patterson. She's the former Bridgewater Chief Investment Strategist. Where we left off was the policies that could matter next year in the case of a Trump win or a Harris win. And in the case of a Trump win, you are one of the people that have said you're worried about the course of inflation, the trajectory here, and the market still has, through the end of next year, almost 120 basis points worth of rate cuts.
Right.
What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, the good news is the Fed is able to bring rates down even though the economy is pretty strong. So that's kind of Goldilocks, right? We're getting lower cost of capital and a fairly resilient economy. Q3 was around 2.8%. That's great for the stock market, for risk assets. The question to me with the election is next year, not the move this week or in December, But if we have about 90 basis points of cuts priced in for next year, and inflation starts ticking up, inflation expectations tick up on the back of some of the policies and policy proposals, the Fed might not be able to do 90, and that's what the market's discounting. So then for stocks to do well, you need an offset from a strong economy to meet those EPS growth expectations of 14%. We might get it. Like, one thing I wanted to mention, regardless of the fiscal that happens next year, JP Morgan put together an estimate, and I've checked it quickly. I think it's correct. They're expecting just in the next year, the top 7 tech companies spending over $500 billion in CapEx and R&D. I mean, so you think the CHIPS and Science Act, huge. It was $52 billion. This is $500 billion. So even if current fiscal stimulus is fading a little bit before the next round of whatever, you have this, what I would call, private sector stimulus. And that's going to feed into the economy in lots of different ways and provide another level of support. And I think sometimes investors forget about that. They're focusing on the fiscal because of the election, but there's also this private sector momentum, especially from tech, that's pretty significant.
Well, and that tracks with Facebook saying they're going to spend, what, $98 billion? Microsoft
like
renting a nuclear power plant?
Yes.
I mean...
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up tech because it's often lost in these conversations. And I want to talk a little bit more sector specific because you think about Trump's tariff proposals, for example. We focus on China, but he's promised a 10 to 20% tariff on all imported goods, not just Chinese imported goods. And you think about clothing, for example. Apparently 97% of clothing sold in the U.S. is imported. So if you think about sector effects, I mean, which industry stands to potentially be hit the hardest here?
I mean, I'm nervous, very nervous about agriculture in the United States if the tariffs go ahead. What we saw in the first term for former President Trump is that that was the bullseye for retaliation. Go after American farmers, go after things that are iconic to America, right? So Harley Davidsons, I think
Levi's, bourbon, yes.
But farmers. And so the government had to give unprecedented subsidies to farmers to try to even things out. But even that didn't help them. And structurally, they lost a lot of market share to Brazil and things like soybeans. So the farm community has never recovered from this. And if we're going after not just China, but a number of countries, the retaliation is going to be a lot bigger than last time, I fear. And that's something that we have to think about in terms of how it hurts the business community, business sentiment, this business investment I just mentioned.
What do you make of tax policy? Because that has a lot to do with animal spirits as well, right? And we see a big difference in Trump's proposed 15%, Kamala's proposed 28% on corporate taxes. Right. It only makes up, I think, 9% of receipts, but it still changes the way you think about doing business. And then, of course, how you and I and Shonali and Katie are affected individually, right? Right. It's going to be a big difference.
I mean, the thing to me from Trump's first term versus now, in the first term, we had very large tax cuts, corporate rate going from 35 to 21, and we had relatively small tariffs. This time we have, we'll see how big, what gets through, but smaller tax cuts being proposed and huge tariffs. So the degree of the influence from these two policies, if they get enacted as put forward, the math is going to be different. And remember, in 2017, Trump wins, the market takes off on hopes and then actual confirmation of tax cuts. But then in 18, when the tariffs started, we saw the S&P fall 20% between September and December that year on a combination of the trade war fears and the Fed saying, okay, this fiscal has overheated the economy, we're going to raise rates faster. So if you bought stocks on Inauguration Day 2017, by the end of 18, you made 4%. That's it. It was a round trip. So I think for everybody, it's important not to just think about tax policy or trade policy, but think about all of it together. And then the outside forces like monetary policy, like China stimulus. If you're going to get your election trade right, you have to be putting it all together.
I was living in Germany, by the way, in 2018 and desperately wanted to buy a Harley Davidson Fat Bob, but it became too expensive for me because of, I guess, the tariffs.
Well, maybe get it in now. It's your birthday. Buy it today.
About the Harley for like 3 months now. Just pull the trigger, dude.
Okay.
Today's your day.
Yeah, today's your day. And it's interesting when you think about, there's actually a great story on the Bloomberg terminal right now about those election trades. And it goes down to, for example, even Centene and United Health, where they could have a $25 billion revenue drop if the subsidies under Obamacare, it goes down to the single stock level. I do want to go back to something you were saying before. I want to pull up the 10-year for a moment, because if you shorted it at the end of September, you probably have made a lot of money by now. And the question is, how significant is that trade? Do you think that that short trade can last until the end of the year?
I think one has to be super cautious right now. First of all, we don't know who's going to win. We don't know when the results are going to get known. And despite what they say on the campaign, we don't know what policies they'll prioritize. In 2016, the initial trade on Trump's victory was sell emerging markets. This is terrible. It lasted for, like, what, an hour or two? The Mexican peso weakened significantly against the dollar for a few days, and then it recouped everything. So I would not be chasing any of these trades right now. I would wait till we get through whatever this process is, whether it's tonight, next week, and then figure out what's going on. The one thing, and you all mentioned this at the start of the show, certainty helps. Right now, we're at peak uncertainty. And once we get an answer and we know the rules of the road we're likely dealing with, I mean, the economy is doing well. The Fed is cutting rates. This is still a decent backdrop for equity. So if we get a dip, it's probably a buying opportunity. But to your point, which stocks, which sectors, it will depend on the winner.
Rebecca, I learn so much every time you come in, and even with the uncertainty, I feel like you improve my perspective. So I really appreciate you being here with us.
She encouraged you to buy a Harley.
And that also, I will tell my wife. Rebecca Patterson, former Bridgewater chief investment strategist. The Boeing strike is over. Shares of the plane maker on the rise. We'll talk about Katie's favorite story next. This is Bloomberg.
Asia is at the forefront of some of the world's biggest stories. I'm Sherrian in Tokyo.
And I'm Heidi Stroud-Watts here in Sydney, where the trading day begins. We're here in the center of all the action to get you set up with the numbers, news, and knowledge you need for the day ahead.
The demand is indeed recovering. We've been waiting for this moment.
The opportunity of a century.
Join us on Bloomberg The Asia Trade. Weekdays only on Bloomberg TV. Context changes everything.
Politics to the world of business, Joe Matthew and Keely Lyons deliver news, insight, and analysis live every trading day. Balance of Power live around the world every weekday, only on Bloomberg. It's the world's second largest economy with a growing influence in global affairs. But geopolitical uncertainties, deflationary pressures, and questions about foreign investment linger. Bloomberg, the China Show, brings you the unmatched expertise you need to keep track of breaking news, in-depth market analysis, and the most influential newsmakers in and around China. Bloomberg, the China Show. Weekdays around the world, right here on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Key investors, top executives, global innovators. Join me for in-depth conversations with the biggest newsmakers on the day's top stories. Insight with Haslinda Onen, only on Bloomberg.
All right, let's quickly talk about Boeing here, because we have an end to the strike. We have an agreement. Boeing workers agreed to a 38% wage increase over 4 years. They also agreed to enhance retirement contributions. We know that was a big sticking point. That ends a 53-day strike. You had 59% of union members voting in favor, and boy, was it painful to get here.
But no defined benefit pension.
No. We knew that there was going to be a lot of daylight there, and they did get some concession there. This is obviously good news for Boeing. A little bit of a reaction in shares, but shares still off about 40% year to date. This is Bloomberg.
make sure that we're exposed to categories that continue to be relevant to consumers, that we're positioned in categories where we have a competitive right to win.
By strategically adding and shedding assets, General Mills has turned over about 20% of its net sales base in the last 6 years. It's dramatically expanded its pet food platform, starting with the purchase of Blue Buffalo pet products in 2018. That expansion dovetailed with a boom in demand.
Pet in the U.S., pet feeding and treating, is a $50 billion category. It's almost 5 times the size of a category like cereal.
Is this the future of the company? I mean, we so much associate General Mills with breakfast and cereals, human breakfast and human cereals. Are we now going to be thinking about General Mills much more as a pet food company?
I think you'll be thinking about General Mills as a food company, where we treat all the members of the family like family.
The humanization of pets is actually the biggest driver of pet food and pet treating growth. It has derivatives in not only feeding, which is the core thing that most households where most of the dollars go against the pet, but treating. And then you start to branch out to things like vitamins and minerals and supplements.
People really love their pets. They want to take care of their pets like they do their family, and it really is a global phenomenon. That's why we recently entered the China market with Blue Buffalo. That's why we bought Edgar & Cooper recently in Europe, because we see the same kinds of trends that have played out here in the U.S. playing out all over the world.
There is this real momentum from Wall Street. We are basically deep in the European earnings season.
Take a look at how we're faring when it comes to Asian markets.
Get your fixed income fix. Watch Bloomberg Real Yield every Friday right here on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Remember the 5th of November. Hopefully no gunpowder, treason, or plot. This is Bloomberg Open Interest. I'm Matt Miller. We are just 15 seconds away from the start of the cash trade on this Election Day 2024. You can see that futures are up mildly, 0.2% on the S&P, about 1/3 on NASDAQ futures right now. We do have Russell futures down, so the small cap's not faring quite as well on this day. I wonder how much volume we're going to see. I wonder how much volatility we're going to see because, of course, it's a 50-50 tie right now. No one really knows who's going to win the election, and the differences, at least in policy proposals, are massive. You heard the opening bell down at the New York Stock Exchange. You've got Hyatt ringing the bell there down at the NASDAQ market site. You've got Movember, the people who first I guess got me to grow a mustache, and I'm so glad. It's so comfortable on the top part of my lip. Katie, what have you got in terms of the major averages here? What are we doing on this 5th of November?
All right, a little bit of a rally to kick off Matt's birthday, of course. It's also Election Day, I hear. The S&P 500 currently higher by about 0.3%. Big Tech, your outperformer, at least at this moment, currently higher by about 0.5%. As Matt pointed out, a little bit of a downdraft in the small caps. They've been your mild outperformer over the past month or so, but the Russell 2000 currently off about 0.3%. A little bit more action if you look under the hood. Of course, Boeing, we're keeping an eye on that one because workers voted to accept their new labor contract that ends a 53-day strike that crippled jetliner production. That, of course, is just one of many issues facing Boeing at this moment. Shares down about 40% year to date, but at least for this morning, Shanali, up about 1%.
And Katie, I'm looking at here perhaps the next national treasure. We're looking at Palantir soaring, reporting second quarter profit just soaring, raising operating income forecast. U.S. commercial revenue expected to climb over 50% this year. Palantir adds another 14% on top of its 141% gain this year. All-time highs today, Matt.
Yeah, all-time highs for Palantir. It's a different story for Ferrari. The luxury car maker is lower after shipments declined in the third quarter. The drop, as you may guess, was led by China. In that region, deliveries slumped 29%. As a result, Ferrari which has actually tripled in the past 5 years, so it's been up big, is down 6%. Today, 240 million Americans are eligible to vote. Let's take a look at the election trade. For that, we go to Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle. Abby, what do you got?
Well, stocks today, as you all were just talking about, just mildly in the green. But let's take a look at a cross-asset picture since the time roughly when VP Kamala Harris entered the race against Donald Trump. So you can see stocks overall higher up about 12%. The fact that it's big tech, maybe a small nod against Donald Trump since he's expected, his administration is expected, potential administration could be negative toward big tech. Invesco Solar ETF up slightly, maybe a nod toward Kamala Harris. Bitcoin, though, and DJT both up in a big way, so that would be a vote for Trump. As for the predicted odds, it's interesting. So the polls super tight. That was the case with the predicted odds yesterday. VP Harris yesterday in the lead. Now we have Donald Trump, the former president, at 55%, VP Harris at 50%, still close, but the betting odds favoring a Trump presidency right now. And then finally, irrespective of who wins, Katie, one thing we know, volatility. Take a look at this VIX. It is at basically the highs of the year if we don't have the yen carry trade spike that preceded this period here. And it's interesting, you could have some investors buying volatility, agnostic of who wins. Steve Sosnick over at Interactive Brokers, though, yesterday told me he thinks this spike in VIX, this has everything to do with hedging around uncertainty in the election.
Well, it'll be certainly fun to see how quickly those hedges unwind. Abigail Doolittle, thank you so much. Let's keep the conversation going now with Miller Tabak, Chief Market Strategist Matt Maley joining us on this election day. Great to have you with us, Matt. And I want to talk about tail risks here and basically the possibility that we get a contested election. I stole this stat from RBC's note this morning that if you take a look at the 2000 election, the S&P 500 fell nearly 12% between election day and its December low. If we get a disputed election here, how big of a wild card would that be?
Yeah, Katie, I think it's going to be a huge wild card. I mean, because we have even more uncertainty now around the world than we did back then. Now, I do have to admit that, back in 2000, we were at the beginning of the, the unwinding of the internet bubble. So that may have played a role. And of course, people say we have an AI bubble now. But, the geopolitical issues that we face, I mean, if we don't know who the president is, and especially if we don't know who's going to control Congress, both of our allies and our adversaries going to think, and that uncertainty, I think, will grow in a major way. And as we all know, markets don't like uncertainty, and they've kind of ignored it so far. But I don't think they'll be able to ignore that kind of uncertainty if it goes to that kind of similar situation to 2000.
We talk so much, Matt, about the Trump trade. What would a Harris victory mean today? Is that just status quo with the Biden administration? Are there any discernible differences in the little economic policy proposals that she's shared?
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard to know. I mean, and as one of your previous guests said, we don't know for what's actually going to pass. What are they going to be able to get done? What's going to be the makeup of Congress? I mean, if it's all Republican or all Democrat, that's going to be one thing. But if it's split at all, especially given that the any kind of majority, especially in the House, is going to be quite narrow, it's hard to know when that'll come to fruition. My big concern, to be honest with you, is that the uncertainty, even if we get a definitive winner on all these fronts by tomorrow or by the end of the week, we still have this situation in the Middle East. And I honestly think that the VIX has been elevated more so because of that situation than the election, or at least equally so. And as much as people would like to think that that's de-escalating, it really isn't. And I think that's something that people need to push back in the front of their focus as we move past this week.
Matt, to that end, there is this notion out there that after this election, the uncertainty clears up and then all roads lead to go to investing, whether it's certain sectors or the stock market or the bond market. But we are, like Matt has been saying, not far from all-time highs. Does the uncertainty persist into next year, regardless of the outcome of the election?
I think it does, because we have this, with the stock market trading at all-time highs. That's great. but it's also very, very expensive. And, you know, some people say, well, 22 times forward earnings isn't, in next 12 months of earnings isn't that expensive for certain reasons. I'd say that it is. But also you get 3 times sales. That's incredibly expensive. And we have a situation where earnings growth right now, I mean, as much as people talk about how good this earnings season has been, earnings growth for 2025, the estimates, has actually gone down slightly, only 1%. But, you know, with, you know, we in 2023, when the market rallied 25% on zero earnings growth, we took all that growth from this year and next year. And so we need something more. I mean, as much as 14% growth next year sounds good, at 22 times earnings, we actually need something more than that. So, and then we have this concern about our interest rates going to stay high. That creates the problem with the valuations. And again, I have to go back to the situation in the Middle East, which I think is only going to get worse. I'm afraid.
Yeah, I think we can agree that there's always going to be uncertainty, whether it's political, economic, geopolitical, monetary, et cetera. But I do want to talk a little bit cross-asset here. Of course, we're speaking to you at 9:38 a.m. We tend to focus on equities, but you think about this election, the outcome and the aftermath, which asset class might stand to see the most impact? Is it equities? Is it the bond market? Is it currencies, for example? What should we actually be watching here?
Well, I mean, there's so many, and I think they're all, to say just one is difficult, but you're right. The bond market is going to be critically important. I mean, remember back in, it was just 6 weeks ago, we have a Fed meeting this week, of course, and at the last Fed meeting, everybody's saying, oh my gosh, you know, the Fed's going to cut rates by, you know, a gazillion percent. The interest rates are going to keep going down right into the end of the year and into next year. And that's completely turned on its head. Now people are saying, oh my gosh, interest rates are going to stay high. We have some people looking for the 10-year to get above 5% next year. My kind of feeling, though, is that, you know, everybody was on one side of the boat and they were wrong. We've almost moved a little bit too much to the other side of the boat. And I think that we could get a surprise here. In other words, I think interest rates could come down. Will that really be bullish for other assets? Well, it depends on why it happens. Again, if you think that the Middle East has died down and that we're not going to get any worse, you also have to believe that Iran is okay with, I'm sorry, that Israel is okay with Iran becoming a nuclear power. I just don't think that's going to happen. So if the bonds rally in a flight to safety situation, we have it's a whole different can of beans. So there's a lot of risk out there still. We usually rally into the end of the year in an election year, but there's a lot of issues out there that I think are going to keep people on their toes.
Matt, thanks so much for checking in with us. Great to get your take. Matt Maley there from Miller Tabak talking to us just 10 minutes after the market open on Election Day. Coming up, Professor Wendy Schiller from Brown University joins us as Wall Street awaits the outcome of the election. Indeed, volumes, at least in the first 10 minutes, are a little bit light. We'll see if traders sit on their hands for the rest of the day. This is Bloomberg.
Behind the bright lights and adrenaline of pro sports is an equally exciting world of negotiations and deal-making.
That's what we cover each week on our podcast, The Deal.
I love the fact that you have, we say the cojones, but we can't say that in Bloomberg.
Maybe moxie?
Yeah, moxie. I'm Alex Rodriguez, former baseball player turned business executive.
And I'm Jason Kelly, a journalist at Bloomberg. Over the next couple months, we'll hear from all-stars like Billie Jean King.
Well, what should I learn? What should I do? I said, learn the business.
Jay Williams.
You're the asset, but how do you become the principal?
Paul Rabel.
We're going to be the league of digital, and that's why you're going to invest.
Adina Friedman.
I definitely am competitive.
David Rubenstein.
People don't come up to me on the street and say, let's talk about this private equity deal you did recently. No, nobody does that. They say, let's talk about the team.
And so many more.
You need a clap?
No, I didn't Ready? Go.
countdown to the market open as we bring you the first trades across Europe.
We'll debate the most important stories and what will drive the big investment decisions throughout the morning. I'm Guy Johnson.
I'm Kriti Gupta.
And I'm Anna Edwards. Join us every weekday morning for the opening trade, live at 7 a.m. here in London.
Only on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
U.S. jobs numbers are released. Bloomberg has the report under surveillance with crucial data and expert analysis at terminal speed. Nobody covers jobs day like Bloomberg.
As we spend some time here on the broader presidential race,
let's focus in on European politics.
Makes you wonder how politics might play out.
Jumpstart your trading day on Bloomberg Open Interest.
2 hours of single stock stories that are driving the opening bell action.
We'll take you to Wall Street, Main Street, the C-suite, and beyond.
These are companies that are growing their market.
The great companies in the U.S. are the companies hitting the cutting edge. That's a different story.
Get the inside track on what's buzzing in markets.
With the players who are shaping the narrative.
If you have bad earnings reports, you're going to get punished.
They're not buying what the industry is selling.
Join us on Bloomberg Open Interest every trading day, only on Bloomberg. All right, it's time now for our top calls. Some of the analyst action in focus this morning. And first up, DZ Bank raising Chevron to a buy. The energy giant, of course, beat earnings expectations last week. That was thanks to rising oil production in the Permian Basin. Next up, we have Telsey Advisory downgrading Dollar Tree, saying it's no longer a buy, also cutting its price target. The firm says that the departure of its CEO reduces confidence in the company. It also limits visibility on Dollar Tree's strategy. And finally, we have Bernstein upgrading eBay to a buy, saying that the stock's plunge following earnings last week is an opportunity for investors to buy the dip, Matt.
All right, let's get back to the election, shall we? Katie, as millions of Americans head to the polls in a tightly contested race. Joining us now is Wendy Schiller, Brown University professor of political science. Wendy is a registered independent, but you know, like the rest of us, I'm sure you've watched the authoritarian bent that Donald Trump displays, at least in his rhetoric. Nonetheless, I heard Oprah Winfrey in a campaign speech yesterday saying, and I quote, "If we don't show up tomorrow, it is entirely possible that we will not have the opportunity to ever cast a ballot again." Is that kind of rhetoric really fair? I mean, are American institutions so weak that Donald Trump and his Republican enablers could end democracy in 2 years?
No. I mean, I think it's highly unlikely. I don't want to be too sanguine about this, but it's highly unlikely. You know, the Constitution gives states the power to regulate all the elections, time, place, and manner of elections. And we have 50 states, and we have a lot of ambitious politicians in this country. So if you have Democratic senators, for example, U.S. senators or Democratic House members, Republicans are going to want elections to unseat them. And if the Democrats win the House, Republicans are absolutely going to want to preserve elections for 2026. Not to mention people who want to be president of the United States in 2028. And Donald Trump is, at the moment, constitutionally prohibited from being elected to serve an additional term. So whether he tries to challenge that or repeal the 22nd Amendment, that's part of the constitutional process. But no, I'm not concerned that he'll spend the energy trying to end elections or that Republicans will see it in their interest to end elections.
So highly unlikely in your words, and maybe not the best tactic, as you're saying, by Oprah Winfrey and the Democrats. But to be fair, I mean, Trump and his supporters have suggested similar themes. And I'm wondering, Wendy, in your view, is this just a feature of American politics right now, this very dramatic language, rhetoric, if you want to call it that?
Well, there's been dramatic rhetoric and language used for 150 years. I mean, this country has been divided, fiercely divided over other things in its past. And at this point in time, we are the most diverse, we are the most free, and we are the most participatory that we've been in more than 100 years. There are a lot of voices in America that want to be heard. So yes, we are hearing the very loud voices. Some of them can be frightening on any side of the political aisle. Political violence, for example, we We have been a politically violent country, and we are still grappling with that, especially with the availability of guns. So we do have challenges here, but we are a noisy democracy. We've always been a noisy democracy, and the more people who can participate, like we're seeing record turnouts in voting, for example, the noisier it will get. And remember, in the past, voting suppression has been very fierce, particularly among African Americans, directed at African Americans. But women have just only been voting, frankly, for a little bit more than 100 years. So we have faced these kinds of difficulties before in a more closed society. Now we are more open, and now we're hearing more noise.
Wendy, I'd love for you to weigh in here on what comes after the vote, because there are a lot of expectations on election-related litigation. How might lawsuits start to tie up results coming out of tonight?
Well, you have to expect that we'll see a repeat of 2020. The Trump campaign has resources. They will challenge, particularly in very close counties, particularly in some of these swing states, if they lose. They'll challenge. They challenged last time, I think, a total of 60 court cases on voter fraud or, misbehavior by states. They lost in, I think, every single case for the most part. So we have apparatus, we have secretaries of state, we have state governors that are prepared for challenges. I think they're also preparing, frankly, for potential violence in state capitals. We still have to get through the electoral college process in December, January 6th certification, and January 20th inauguration. There are many things to get through before we sort of settle on the next president. I don't expect as much of a violent reaction, theoretically, from the Democrats if Donald Trump wins definitively, but they do have the resources to challenge. And unlike Al Gore, who went to the Supreme Court, but you can argue maybe didn't make the most of all of his challenges in 2000, I think Kamala Harris will, particularly where it's extremely tight.
Actually, Matt Maley from Miller Tabak. Sorry,
Matt Miller.
Yes, Matt Maley from Miller Tabak just was talking to us, and he's concerned about, or at least alarmed by, the possibility of a tie. I know it's a remote possibility, Wendy, but a lot of people don't know it could happen. How unlikely is it? And then what would be the result?
Well, if there's a tie, the Constitution provides that the election a tie in the Electoral College, that the House of Representatives decides the election. And in that case, because of the way that it's structured, each state gets a vote, and if Republicans have more members of the House in a particular delegation, they're going to swing that state's vote. So if it is a tie, it's most likely, not definitely, most likely would go to Donald Trump if all of the members of the House who are Republicans stay loyal to Donald Trump. So that's one possibility. Just given the breakout and given the polling and the trends and the impact of Senate races in many of these swing states, I don't think it will be a tie. I think if the Democrats can hold, particularly the incumbents in these swing states like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, for example, Nevada, and if that's enough, it will lift Kamala Harris up in those states. So I don't see a tie. It's possible. It's happened before in American history in the turn of the century, 1800, and Thomas Jefferson won that in the House. So we're just gonna have to wait and see. We have a Constitution, we have rules, we have the rule of law, and I think most Americans do not want to walk away from any of that. And I think that in the end, they will do their very best to keep it.
Wendy, we thank you so very much for your time today. Of course, hopefully we know just in a matter of hours, maybe days, maybe weeks at worst, but hopefully sooner rather than later. Wendy Schiller of Brown University. Now coming up, CoreWeave, one of the hottest AI startups gearing for an IPO. Details up next in our Wall Street Beat.
Good morning. This is Bloomberg Surveillance.
Welcome back to the opening trade.
This is Bloomberg Technology.
This is the Asia Trade.
You're watching the close. Welcome to Balance of Power.
This is
My general advice is continue to seek out companies or people that are maybe one stage or two stages ahead of you. And I think this is generalizable to not just to startups, but anyone seeking fast growth in their own professional lives, in their careers too. What does greatness look like? Try to seek out people who've been there, done that before, and then try to not connect with one, but try to interview 3, 5, 10 people to see what is a general pattern of greatness that look like that will get you to the next level of the company, next stage, maybe a year, 12 months from now, 24 months from now. Seek out people who kind of went down the path a few times. Then you'll start to find this pattern that start to emerge. What are things that you need to have 12 months from now, 24 months from now that you currently don't have? Then try to like build a path towards that. It's almost like Amazon's or Jeff Bezos' mantra of working backwards. Think about what your end game or next stage look like, and then figure out your steps to getting there and who do you need to work with, upgrading or coaching your existing team or recruiting from somewhere else to really level your leadership. Because ultimately, the job of a CEO is to do 3 things, right? One is get the strategy right for your company, making sure it's executed, get the right teams onboarded, getting the resources, whether it be fundraising or allocating your resources. So strategy, people, or team, figuring out how you need to navigate those things to get to the next level.
When I was younger, I used to be in bands. I'd play drums in bands and toured America with them. Did a lot of session drumming, recorded albums. So yeah, it was good fun doing the drumming. The only reason I stopped it, well, I still play, but not as serious as I did when I was younger. But drumming doesn't pay the bills. I was never good enough to be able to pay the bills with it, but it was good fun. I started RJF, and the reason I started it was I saw a gap in the market for particular early stage and startup businesses. With the experience that I've got of running businesses, of being a finance director at the very biggest companies in the world to being finance director of small startups, we were looking at providing more than just basic accountancy services. So yes, we'll do all that, we'll do all the basic, all the statutory side of things that you need to do. But there's so much more value that we can add, and I wanted to have my experience to help these startups because a lot of them don't really know where to go. You can go to your high street accountants and they can do a good job compliance-wise, but you would question whether they've actually been in the firing line of a business. Have you been in a business where you're thinking, how do I pay wages next week? Or business is really successful, what do we do with it next? Or how do we grow it? How do we grow into international territories? Or how do we grow our markets? How do we expand? So a lot of the experience I've seen over the years and seen different types of business in different sectors, I thought, well, it's a real value that I can add to these businesses as opposed to just being an FD, because a lot of these businesses can't afford an FD. But if we can take care of their statutory side of things, the compliance side of things, I'm on hand to be able to help and advise businesses with their growth strategy, or if they're in difficulty, help them through these times.
For a second. Bailey voted this morning but got no sticker.
That's so sad.
What's
I got
the
my
point?
sticker on
Right?
Sunday. I wore it all day.
I hope you tweeted about that.
I did. I see. I'm not even on camera. They already got rid of me. I did not tweet about it, but I should post.
Come back.
All right, get out of here. Coming up next, Chris Marangi joins us from Gabelli Funds. Plus, we're going to talk to the Snap-on CEO, Nicholas Pinchuk, and the founder of Koval Distillery to talk tariffs on whiskey. This is Bloomberg.
also an owner, I should have pointed out, of 3 major sports teams.
That's right.
And you're the first woman, as I understand it, the first woman to own 3 major, have stake in 3 major sports teams. Is that right?
Yes, and we'll say African American.
You were approached by the owner then of the, I guess, the Washington Wizards and the Washington Caps about maybe buying the Washington Mystics, which is the women's basketball team. And what did you say?
Well, first of all, Zabe Poland. He did come to me and Susan O'Malley, and they said, Abe Poland says, look, I want you to be the face of the Washington Mystics. And I said, what do you mean be the face of? He says, I want you to buy this team. His health was failing. And I have to tell you, and a lot of women can understand this, we never get these opportunities. So that was the first thing that struck me, and I was flattered. I was really flattered. I said, well, Abe, what are the financials on this? And he handed them to me. He says, well, they're not making money. But I was still intrigued about team ownership.
Middle East and Africa. Vibrant resources and high-yield investment opportunities abound. Join me on Horizons Middle East and Africa for the stories, newsmakers, and insight from this exciting region. Now weekdays, only on Bloomberg.
Bringing you up-to-the-minute geopolitical news whenever and wherever it happens. I'm Stephen Engel at the Forbidden City in Beijing, and this is Bloomberg.
News on the Hour, sponsored by Progressive Insurance.
I'm Deborah Rodriguez. Election Day is finally here.
The ball is in the courts of the American people. Today is the day.
GOP vice presidential hopeful J.D. Vance joined millions of Americans and cast his ballot this morning, he in Cincinnati.
I, of course, voted for Donald Trump and myself. So did my wife, and we also, for all the locals out there, we voted for Bernie Moreno for the United States Senate.
Mr. Trump is expected to vote next hour at a rec center in Palm Beach. Our latest polls show he and Vice President Harris are basically tied in 7 key battleground states, among them Wisconsin. Reporter Bruce Marcus is in Eagle River.
Most polls in the Badger State show the race here is a toss-up. Democratic Governor Tony Evers is not surprised.
Wisconsin's a purple state.
People here generally know who they'll vote for, in part because of their dislike for the other candidate. Here's a Harris supporter.
Trump is just the complete opposite of what we need. He's a criminal. He's a felon.
But this man thinks the former president is the only good choice.
What has Harris done? Not a thing.
I'm Jim Crisula in Raleigh, North Carolina. 4.2 million Tar Heel residents, a record number, cast ballots during in-person early voting.
Made me happy to see people getting out early to, cast their vote, have their voice heard.
I just really wanted to make sure that my vote got cast.
Early bird gets the first worm.
57% of the state's 7.8 million registered voters cast ballots in this key battleground state during the early voting period.
Voting officials across the country have stepped up security for poll workers. Derek Bowens is elections director in Durham County, North Carolina.
We've implemented de-escalation training alert badges for all of our chief judges and site coordinators to wear. If they press that button, they'll have law enforcement out to their site immediately.
The Secret Service has put up an 8-foot-tall ring of anti-scale fencing around the White House. Voters in 10 states are deciding on abortion rights measures today. Helen Brewer is a policy specialist with the National Conference of State Legislatures.
All of these would establish a right to abortion in the state constitution, and there's a lot of variation across the board in how detailed or how general that right is.
Anyone you know coughing, sneezing, feeling generally miserable, it may not be COVID or flu. The CDC reports the number of people coming down with a milder lung infection, walking pneumonia, is 10 times greater this year than last. The incidence is up across all age groups. S&P futures are up 37. This is CBS News.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney.
The real outperformance has been the U.S. corporate high yield.
Are the companies lean enough? Have they trimmed all the fat?
The semiconductor business is a really cyclical business.
Breaking market headlines and corporate news from across the globe.
Do investors like the M&A that we've seen?
These are two big-time blue-chip companies.
The window between the peak and cut changing super fast.
Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
Good Tuesday morning from the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio in New York City to our worldwide audience. We're also streaming live on YouTube, so you can head over to youtube.com and search Bloomberg Podcast. That's where you'll find us. Emily Garfeo sitting in for Alex Steele. Emily, thanks for sitting in with us for the next 2 hours. Appreciate it. We're going to be wall-to-wall here on the election. We've got a lot of smart voices from around the country giving us the latest thoughts on how this election may go, what it may mean for markets going forward. So we'll have some smart discussion coming up throughout the next 2 hours on this Bloomberg Intelligence program. Right now, let's kick everything off with Mr.
All right, Paul and Emily, we've been brought to you by IBKR Financial Advisors. Switch to Interactive Brokers for lowest cost global trading and turnkey custody solutions. No ticket charges, no conflicts of your interest at ibkr.com/RIA. We are data dependent, so let's start there. The Institute for Supply Management Services Index, it is coming in higher than expectations. 56, the reading there. Remember, anything over 50, that's the dividing line. That is expansion, and services, of course, the biggest part of the U.S. economy. Come again at 56. The expectation was for 53.8, and the previous reading was 54.9. So strength there in the biggest part of the economy. S&P 500, 45 points higher. That's up 0.8%, 57.58 on the index. 10 of the 11 major industry groups in the S&P 500 are up. Tech stocks in the lead. Palantir Technologies, best performing stock there, up over 15% after reporting quarterly revenue that beat analyst estimates. They also raised the forecast for operating income in the current quarter. They were citing high demand for its artificial intelligence software. And, oh yeah, there's an election. Julian Emanuel at Evercore ISI says if history is any guide, a close election may actually be good for stocks.
There have been a number of races where we come into November and the margin is 2, 1, or 0. I guess this one is 0, probably. And guess what? The stock market has gone up into year-end 6 out of 7 times.
A worst performing stock right now, the S&P 500, have to mention this. Celanese Corporation down 22%. The chemical manufacturer's fourth quarter profit disappointing in the third quarter. They also slashed their dividend. The Dow Jones Industrial Average up 250 points right now. The Nasdaq 100, 211 points higher. 2-year yields up 7 basis points, 423 right now. The 10-year also close to 7 basis points higher. That is at 435. And we check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Emily and Paul.
All right, John Tucker, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Emily Garfeo, sitting in for Alex Steele. I'm Paul Sweeney, live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, streaming as well on YouTube. What are you looking at today, Emily?
Well, we're just kind of looking at what the market is doing. I actually thought that there was going to be less movement in the major indexes, but we are seeing the NASDAQ 100 up 1%.
Yeah.
You'd think that people would be kind of waiting to put on any more trades until this result is
futures
cited.
were kind of mixed. Futures were kind of mixed. We got it opened up. We've seen some strength here. We had the ISM data, as John was just reporting, coming in better than expected. The manufacturing side of the economy still in contraction, but the services doing well. Let's check in on the market moves. Abigail Doolittle, she's a market correspondent for Bloomberg. She joins us here in our studio. Abigail, what are you seeing in the markets this morning?
Well, I would agree with both you and Emily in terms of this gain that we're seeing for markets. The S&P 500 up 0.8%. The NASDAQ, as you were just talking about, up about 1%. The best day in nearly a month. So over the last couple of weeks, for the most part, stocks have basically been churning between small gains and losses on the uncertainty around this event. You could also make the case it has to do with the Fed. So that does stand out a bit. And earlier today, I was taking a cross-asset look of different markets over the last 3 months. So roughly over the time period when VP Harris entered the race, the NASDAQ 100 up about 1%, the solar ETF up about 5%, and then you have Bitcoin and DJT both up in a big way. So maybe still leaning a little bit more in the direction of that Trump trade. Now, outside of the Trump trade, there are a ton of idiosyncratic movers. So one that stands out, Archer Daniels Midland, they actually pre-announced to the downside, a bit disappointing. So that stock down, last time I looked, down 6%. Let me just take a quick look right now as I pull it up in my Bloomberg terminal here, down 9%. So they, in addition to pre-announcing to the downside, they've also amended results and they've canceled their call on more accounting errors. I mean, that's just something that folks do not want to hear.
All right, Abigail, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Abigail Doolittle, Chief Markets Correspondent for Bloomberg News, joining us live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. I want to head out to Detroit, Michigan. That's where Romaine Bostick is, Bloomberg Television's co-anchor. Romaine Bostick. Romaine, you're out there in Detroit, Michigan, always an important state in these elections. What are you seeing so far in the great city of Detroit?
Yeah, well, I'm in a polling center here in the northwest section of Detroit City. It opened at 7 a.m. this morning, and the lines were actually surprisingly short. And a big part of the reason was most people actually voted early this time around. At least half of the electorate here in the great state of Michigan cast their ballots prior to Tuesday. This was actually the first election cycle where they were allowed to have early voting. Early voting that started all the way back on October 19th here in Detroit City and on October 26th in other parts of the state. Officials tell me that they are expecting voter turnout to be high. Remember, back in 2020, here in the state of Michigan, we had record turnout. About 70% of active registered voters did turn out to the polls. Right now, based on what we know as of the numbers last night, we were tracking to exceed those numbers. It'll be interesting to see how things shake out as we get deeper into the night, Paul.
And Romaine, in speaking with some of the voters there on the ground, what's the most important issue that these Detroit voters are bringing to the polls?
A lot of economic issues and a lot of foreign policy issues. This is a huge manufacturing state. There's only 2 states in the country that have a larger manufacturing base than Michigan. This is, of course, also a state that has been hit hard by the loss of manufacturing jobs. Despite the fact that Detroit, as well as the broader metro area here, has made progress in diversifying the economy, most voters are basically saying that they want to see more of a long-term plan for how the state is going to address some of these issues, more job training, of course, attracting more businesses to the state as well. Another big topic of conversation here involves foreign policy on 3 fronts. One, on tariffs. Of course, a lot of people are looking for maybe potential support from tariffs to protect the manufacturing industries here, something that President Trump and his surrogates have spent a lot of time in this state trying to sell. The other issue is on foreign policy, particularly when it comes to Israel and Gaza. The Trump campaign has spent an inordinate amount of time here. Trump himself has made at least 25 official stops in this state, of course, including just last night in Grand Rapids, Michigan. They have made a big pitch to the Arab American and Muslim American communities, the highest concentration of those folks than any other state other than California, basically saying that he can end the situation in Gaza and that he can provide protection for them in a way that the Harris administration wouldn't be able to do. He's made a similar pitch to Jewish American voters here, who have also raised a lot of issues about anti-Semitism, and he has also tried to court some of the Eastern European and Polish American voters, a huge voting bloc here in the state of Michigan, many of whom have a lot of concerns about the growing sphere of influence of Vladimir Putin in Europe.
Romain Bostic, thank you so much for your reporting there. Romain Bostic, he's a television anchor. He's a co-host of the Close show on Bloomberg Television. He is remotely broadcasting this today from Detroit, Michigan. Let's head out to Arizona, another key state in this election. Brendan Case joins us, Bloomberg editor on the U.S. national desk for Bloomberg News. Brendan, give us a sense of how things are developing out there in Arizona on this election. What are the key points for you?
So a couple things to mention right off the bat. The polls opened about 2 hours ago. They'll be open until 7 p.m. local time. That's 9 p.m. on the East Coast. But Arizona's a state that depends pretty heavily on mail-in ballots. And they've already gotten many, many ballots from people. And by about 8 o'clock local, 10 o'clock Eastern, they'll be announcing results for a little more than half of the votes in Maricopa County. That's where we are in Phoenix. And Maricopa accounts for actually about 60% of the state voters. And so by this evening, we'll have a good idea of how a large portion of the votes have come in. Does that mean they'll have anything like a clear result? Not necessarily. County officials have been at pains to say that, the voting process, once it wraps up, for the votes to be counted, that could be going on for a day or more.
Brendan, what are the races to watch in Arizona? Obviously, we have the presidential race, but what else is on your mind?
Yeah, so farther down the ballot, there's definitely a few races to keep an eye on. One of them is for the Senate, where you've got Democrat Ruben Gallego against the Republican Carrie Lake, and that, unlike the presidential race, is not as close, at least according to the polls. In the presidential race, you've got Trump and Harris, pretty much tied. Trump might have a slight advantage according to some polling averages. In the Senate race, it's different. You've got Gallego up by about something like 5 percentage points. Whether that, actually comes to pass in the vote, time will tell. Lake says that she's got her own information that suggests a much closer race. But that's a big one to watch. The other one is a ballot measure on abortion, which, obviously is such a big issue at the national level, and we'll see what kind of effect that has on the race here in Arizona.
Brendan, what are the key issues for voters in Arizona this year?
You talk with voters and you hear a lot about the economy. You hear a lot about inflation. Obviously, inflation has come way down, but the memory of inflation, 21, 2022, still lingers. That's a big one. Arizona, of course, is also a border state. And for many people, the border, security, immigration, are issues that loom large. And then you've got, abortion playing such a key role in the national race here in Arizona. The polls suggest a pretty convincing victory for the ballot measure that would establish a right to abortion in the state constitution. Remains to be seen exactly what role that will play in the final vote tallies, but those three issues certainly loom large in the minds of many voters in Arizona.
Brendan, thank you so much for your reporting. Brendan Case, he's the editor on the U.S. national desk for Bloomberg News, joining us remotely from out in Phoenix, Arizona, another swing state. I didn't know 60% of the state's votes are in Maricopa County. It talks to you about the Phoenix market and how big it is.
The concentration in just that area.
Yep, so a lot of key issues there. So we'll have some live reporting throughout the day from battleground states around the country. So we are on top of that as well. Join us for complete coverage of U.S. election results. It kicks off at 5 p.m. Eastern with a 2-hour edition of Balance of Power, followed by coast-to-coast Bloomberg team coverage at 7 p.m. Get live election results and analysis with context tonight on Bloomberg Radio, television, and Bloomberg Podcast YouTube channel. And looking at these markets, Emily, we do have some positive results here. The S&P is up about 0.7%. The NASDAQ up about 0.9%, so keep an eye on that. Bonds trading off, yields pushing a little bit higher. The yield on the 10-year Treasury up about 7 basis points right now, 4.35%. So we'll keep an eye on that. Gold steady, $2,700 an ounce. Bitcoin up over 4%. We're just pressing up against $70,000 per token, so we keep an eye on that. WTI crude oil inching a little bit higher, up about 1%. So we're now over $72 a barrel for WTI crude oil. Looking at the Bloomberg Dollar Index, trading off just slightly. So against some of the top 10 major currencies out there. So again, a little bit of green on the screen here. We're going to have more election coverage coming up from around the country. A lot of important discussion here on the presidential election, as well as the down ballot races in control of the House and the Senate. More coming up. This is Bloomberg. Good morning.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker, the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. It's technology shares that are pushing stocks higher. You have NVIDIA, Microsoft, Tesla, Apple, all in the lead In fact, every major industry group in the S&P 500 is up right now. Information technology, the biggest gainer. The best performing individual stock in the S&P 500 belongs to Palantir Technologies. And right now, Palantir is up just close to 22%. This is the data analysis software company. Third quarter results beat expectations. They raised their full year forecast. A lot of that has to do with artificial intelligence. And then right now you have the S&P 500 44 points higher. That's up 0.8% at 57.57 on the index. The Dow Jones Industrial Average up 270 points. That's a rise of 0.7%. The Nasdaq 100 200 points higher. That is up a full percentage point. Two-year yield 7 basis points higher, 423 there. The 10-year is up 7 basis points. That is at 435. And Goldman Sachs planning to add the most executives to its partnership since David Solomon took over at the firm. The promotions will be announced this week, exceed the previous high of the Solomon era set in 2022 when 80 employees made the cut. Public company, but still partnership. So I guess it's kind of a
unique. It's very
nod to the
unique.
past.
Yes.
We'll say.
Yep. And I think it's key to their culture.
Okay.
And their success. Which is the key to their success. Their culture is the key to their success. The partnership is the key to the culture.
Did you have anything like a partnership at some of your old firms?
Solomon Brothers, I made partner, which was a big deal. And then like 15 minutes later, we were acquired by Sandy Weil and Travelers. And so I got to use the partners dining room twice. So then I went over to Solomon.
Such is the life of Paul.
Yeah, you had an appetizer, but not even a full course.
Then I went to Solomon Smith Barney, just a run-of-the-mill managing director. So, all right, John Tucker, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Emily Grafeo sitting in for Alex Steele. I'm Paul Sweeney. We're live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. Complete coverage of this election throughout the day. Markets trading higher, as John was just reporting. Let's check in with Jennifer Lawless. She's a professor at the University of Virginia. Did you arrange this? Is this your doing?
This was a pleasant surprise.
Very good. Emily Grafeo is also a proud graduate of the University of Virginia down in Charlottesville. Jennifer, what are you looking for today? What should our listeners, our viewers, what should they be paying attention to today?
Well, the most important thing is that every listener who hasn't already cast a ballot go out and vote. And looking at the length of those lines, just getting a sense of the enthusiasm at the polling places, I think will at least let people know whether this is going to be a high turnout election or not. But we're really not going to know anything until this evening when the polls close, and the early signs will be in North Carolina and Georgia.
What are we hearing so far? I guess, or how are you understanding the closing messages from both candidates? I know that Trump is set to speak at 11 a.m.
Perhaps. It's uncertain.
Okay.
It's uncertain, so we'll see.
So, but what are we understanding right now, Professor Lawless, about the closing messages from both candidates?
Well, it seems to me that the closing messages for the Harris campaign are the messages that she's been conveying for the last 90 or 100 days. She's been very disciplined and on script, and that's basically that it's time to turn a new page. If people want new leadership, if they want a new generation, if they want new policies, Kamala Harris is the way forward. And Donald Trump is basically trying to make the case that the Biden-Harris administration broke it and he can fix it. It's a challenge for him, obviously, both because he has a hard time staying on message, but also because he's been president already. So he's trying to portray himself as the change candidate, and she's trying to portray him as the incumbent.
Jennifer, how long are we going to have to wait, do you believe, for the presidential election to be called? I mean, this is going to be a dicey situation from what we understand because of some of the mail-in ballotings and just because it's so close.
It's difficult to know, but if Harris performs well or wins in North Carolina or Georgia, it's hard to see a Trump victory. And then we would likely know early. We would probably know by tomorrow. If Donald Trump wins in North Carolina and Georgia, both of which are states that he's been actively campaigning in, and Republicans typically win, then it could go on for a lot longer because we're going to have to wait for all of the counting in Pennsylvania and perhaps Arizona, both of which are notoriously slow and don't start counting until late.
You have written a number of books that have to do with gender and politics. And I'm wondering, when you look at this presidential race, to what extent has gender played a role? Have you been surprised, I guess, maybe about the lack of gender roles, at least it seems like Vice President Harris has not played up as much that she is a woman running, and she has perhaps brought up other issues a little bit more. But I'm wondering what you think.
That's right. Kamala Harris has not played into the breaking the glass ceiling. She would be the first woman in the White House narrative that we saw very prominently featured in the 2016 campaign of Hillary Clinton. But gender is still very, very significant this election cycle. Not only do we have a substantial gender gap where women are more likely than men to prefer Harris and men are significantly more likely than women to prefer Trump, but the issues on the agenda have also been speaking specifically to gendered roles and gendered concerns. And so the Harris campaign, for example, has really been highlighting reproductive rights and freedom and abortion rights and what a Trump administration would mean for women's bodily autonomy. And the Trump campaign has basically seeded a lot of those female swing voters and has tried very, very hard to motivate young men, especially those between the ages of 18 and 29, to come out and vote under this threat of their country being taken away from them. So even though the sex of the candidate hasn't been as prominently featured in the campaign narratives, the issues and the vying for male versus female voters has been on high display.
Jennifer, below the presidential election, down ballot, what are the key races for you?
The key Senate races to watch are John Tester in Montana. If he somehow manages to hold on, then it's going to be a very good night for the Democrats. And Colin Allred vying against Ted Cruz in Texas. If Allred manages to knock out Ted Cruz, that would be the shocker of the night. It's likely that the Senate will go Republican, but there are a couple of indicators that could be harbingers of success for Democrats.
So what does a professor of politics at the University of Virginia do on election night? Do you stay up all night and hope that a decision comes in, or do you just go to sleep and know that this is going to take a while? Because I'm wondering, like, what we should all be doing.
Well, I committed to you guys for 5 to 10 a.m. tomorrow morning, so a lot of sleep will not be had. But yeah, I mean, it's basically the election day is where it all comes to an end. There's nothing to do anymore. There's nothing to watch. There are no events. There are no final, strategies to assess. This is it. And so once the returns start coming in, it's just a matter of watching and trying to analyze the results of the exit polls that are released and getting a better sense of where the numbers are. But if we look back to 2020, I don't think I slept for 5 days. The winner wasn't announced until Saturday. So it's just a matter of watching those ticking screens the same way that everybody else does and trying to figure out what's going on. But I would tell people that, if Harris doesn't win North Carolina or Georgia early, they can go to sleep because we're not going to know tonight.
All right. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us. Jennifer Lawless, she's a professor at the University of Virginia, joining us from Charlottesville via Zoom. Let's head down to Washington, D.C. Akayla Gardner, White House reporter for Bloomberg News, down in our D.C. bureau. Akayla, what are you hearing from the White House today on Election Day? How is President Biden going to conduct his activities today?
Yeah, well, we still don't know much about President Biden's schedule. We know that Harris today is spending her time at her residence in Washington, D.C. She'll be having an election night party at Howard University, which is her alma mater, and where she had her first race ever, which was her freshman class president of the Liberal Arts College. So today's a huge day both for Biden and for Harris because it could be defining for both of their legacies, because the Democratic Party really made a huge bet forcing Biden out and asking Harris to step in. So this is really a culmination of a lot of hard work and a 107-day campaign for Vice President Harris.
Do you have a sense of the general vibe over at the White House, whether it's veering more optimistic or whether people are taking maybe a more serious attitude today on Election Day?
Well, the Harris campaign is feeling optimistic. They've been talking about early voting numbers. They say they're liking what they're seeing when it comes to women turning out, young people, people of color. So they're very encouraged there, but yet they're still saying this is going to be a very close race. And we heard Vice President Harris say that last night in Philadelphia, where she just emphasized how close this could be and really focused on pushing people to get out to vote. She really emphasized people talking to their family and friends, really trying to have those interpersonal connections to get as many people to vote. And Pennsylvania is a huge state, and it's also a state that tends to vote on Election Day. So that's a state we're going to be watching very closely. And they also don't start counting ballots until today. So that is a state that we're going to be having all eyes on today.
Kayla, at least from my perspective, the Harris campaign used President Biden relatively infrequently. Is that a feeling shared within the White House? And if so, is that a concern, or how's the White House feel about how maybe President Biden was in fact used during this campaign?
Well, there's a reason why President Biden is not at the top of the ticket anymore. He remains very unpopular. They appeared very infrequently, especially in this last 100 days. They feel like as though he could be effective in Pennsylvania, where he's from, and he did have his last rally there this past weekend. But there has been tension there, especially because Vice President Harris has expressed gratitude and respect for him, but she's been really put under pressure to put distance between herself, because a lot of voters are asking, how is your administration going to look different from the Biden administration? And she really started to hone in on a message there, really in the final weeks of her campaign, and we're just gonna have to see if it came in time enough for people to feel as though she will move the country in a different direction than President Biden.
Talk a little bit more about those final messages from both candidates. What did American voters learn from the closing messages from both Trump and Harris?
Yeah, well, it was interesting because Vice President Harris had this huge speech at the Ellipse on Tuesday of last week, where she spoke in front of the White House, and in the same spot where President Donald Trump spoke on January 6th, before those rioters went to the Capitol to try to interfere with the certification of the 2020 election. So she was trying to draw a contrast there with democracy and character, comparing herself to Donald Trump. But really in these past couple days, she has not mentioned his name, and I think that has been a very deliberate decision on her part. She says she's finishing this race the way that she started it, talking about herself, making an affirmative case for herself, talking about quote-unquote joy, which she feels is defining this campaign, and the momentum and enthusiasm around her. So that is really her closing message in the final day. She's trying to draw attention to herself and not as much as a contract with Donald Trump. And that has been super interesting, because in these final days we have heard a lot of violent rhetoric, offensive rhetoric from the Trump campaign, and yet she is not drawing the contrast that she typically has in weeks past.
Kayla, thank you so much for joining us. Kayla Gardner, she's White House reporter for Bloomberg News, joining us from our Washington, D.C. Bureau. We had those closing arguments over the last several days from both candidates, and pretty different, kind of sticking with their talking points. Kamala Harris trying to be pretty positive. Former President Trump, airing a list of grievances and some other issues, but promising better days ahead if he is elected. So we'll see how this plays out. The markets are kind of taking it in stride here today. We got the S&P 500 up about 0.8%. The Nasdaq up about 0.9% here. So some gains in the equity markets here. The VIX coming down, sitting just above 20 right now. I'll call that out for Tom Keene. The 10-year Treasury yielding up 7 basis points. We're now at 4.35% on the 10-year. The 2 years, 4.22. So still a positive yield curve there. So we'll keep an eye on that. We're going to have more coming up for you in just moments. This is Bloomberg Intelligence. Good morning.